The train pulled into Red Hollow just after 2 in the afternoon, and the sound it made was the loneliest sound Evelyn Hartwell had ever heard. That long, dying exhale of steam as the engine slowed, like something giving up. She pressed her face close to the window glass and looked out at the platform. It was small, rougher than she'd imagined. Just a few warped planks raised above the dirt with a hand-painted sign nailed to a post that read, Red Hollow, population 340. The wood of the sign had cracked down the middle, and someone had never gotten around to fixing it. Evelyn sat back. She smoothed the front of her dress with both hands, a nervous habit she'd had since girlhood. The fabric was her best, a deep blue wool she'd saved for the occasion, let out slightly at the waist last autumn and taken in again at the hem this spring. She'd packed it on top of everything else in her traveling bag so it wouldn't wrinkle. That felt like something a fool would do now. She was 31 years old, which she knew was not young, not in the way the word meant when people applied it to unmarried women. She had been a school teacher in Mill Haven, Ohio, for the better part of 9 years. She had lived in the same rented room above the harness shop for 6 of those years, eating her meals alone, grading papers by lamplight, watching the seasons come and go outside a window that faced an alley. She was not unhappy, precisely, but there was a particular kind of tiredness that came from a life built almost entirely of routine and very little else, and she had felt it for a long time before she'd finally answered the advertisement. Widower, age 37. Ranch owner, Red Hollow Territory. Seeks respectable woman of sound character and steady disposition for companionship and marriage. Correspondence, welcome. She had written to him on a Tuesday in March, expecting nothing. His reply came 11 days later. 2 pages. Handwritten. Surprisingly thoughtful. His name was Douglas Whitmore. He wrote about the land, about the way the light fell across the hills in the late afternoon. He wrote that he'd been alone for 4 years and that the silence had started to feel wrong. He didn't write like a man who was performing. He wrote like a man who was tired of pretending he didn't need anyone. They exchanged 16 letters over 5 months. She'd kept every one. She stood now and lifted her traveling bag from the rack above the seat. It was heavier than it should have been. She'd packed too many books. Another thing a fool would do, and she'd done it anyway. The other passengers had already filed out ahead of her. By the time she stepped onto the platform, the crowd had thinned to almost nothing. A few men with freight, a woman collecting a package from the cargo car, a boy chasing a dog around the far end of the platform. Evelyn stood still and looked around. No one was waiting. She told herself that meant nothing. He could have been delayed. A fence down, or cattle loose, or any of the 100 ordinary crises that happened on a working ranch. She had enough for a room at whatever hotel the town had. She could wait. She walked through the station building and out onto the main street of Red Hollow. It was a dirt road with a shallow drainage channel cut along each side, lined with false-fronted buildings that had all been painted at some point and were now in various stages of giving that up. There was a general store, a feed merchant, a barber shop, a small hotel with a porch that sagged in the middle, 2 saloons, a church at the far end, and scattered in between, a handful of other establishments whose signs she couldn't read from where she stood. The whole town had the look of a place that had arrived at a certain size and then simply stopped. A man sitting on a barrel outside the barber shop watched her approach. "Excuse me," she said, "could you tell me where I might find Douglas Whitmore? He owns a ranch outside of town." The man's expression shifted in a way that told her something before he said a single word. It was a small thing, just a flicker behind the eyes, a momentary reassessment, but she caught it, the way you catch a draft through a door you didn't know was open. "Whitmore," he said. "Yes, Douglas Whitmore." He took a slow breath and looked up the street. "You'd be the woman from Ohio, then?" "I would." He nodded, but didn't answer her actual question. Instead, he said, "You might want to talk to Agnes at the hotel. She'd know more than me." "Know more about what?" He looked uncomfortable. "Just go see Agnes." Evelyn walked to the hotel. Her bag felt heavier with every step. Tate. The woman behind the desk was somewhere in her 50s, compact and sharp-eyed, with gray hair pinned back in a way that suggested efficiency over vanity. She looked up when Evelyn came in and something moved across her face. Not the flicker of the man outside, but something fuller, more like recognition mixed with a kind of helpless regret. "You're her," the woman said. "I'm Evelyn Hartwell. I'm here to meet Douglas Whitmore." The woman, Agnes, Evelyn assumed, came around from behind the desk. She was wiping her hands on her apron as if she needed something to do with them. "Come sit down," she said. "Please." "I'd rather stand. Just tell me." Agnes stopped wiping. She looked at Evelyn the way people looked at someone they were about to say something painful to, measuring whether they'd be able to take it. "Douglas Whitmore left Red Hollow," she said, "6 days ago." The words landed strangely. Evelyn heard them clearly, understood each one individually, but for a moment they didn't assemble into meaning. "Left," she repeated. "He sold the ranch, everything. Took his money and went, no one knows where exactly. Some say he had a woman in Denver he'd been corresponding with at the same time. Some say he just got cold feet and ran." Agnes paused. "I'm sorry. I sent a telegram to Millhaven, to the address he gave me from your letters. I don't know if it arrived." It hadn't. Or if it had arrived after she'd already left. Evelyn set her traveling bag down, not because she intended to stay, just because her arm was tired. "His ranch," she said. "He sold it. To Caleb Mercer. Caleb's place runs adjacent. He'd been trying to buy that parcel for years." Agnes hesitated. "I want you to know, most people in this town had no idea Whitmore was corresponding with anyone. He kept his business private. What he did, it wasn't decent. And I want you to know I think so." Evelyn looked at the woman. She didn't doubt that Agnes meant it, but kind intentions didn't change the arithmetic of her situation. She had $43 and some coins in her purse. Her position in Millhaven had been filled the week after she'd given notice. Her rented room had been let to a young couple already. She had no family left. Her mother had died 3 winters ago, her father before that. Her one brother living in a city back east with a wife who'd made it quietly clear there was no room for a permanent house guest. She had nowhere to go. She didn't say any of this. There were things you didn't say to strangers, no matter how kind their faces were. "How much is a room?" she said instead. She took the cheapest room they had, which was on the 2nd floor at the back of the building, with a window that looked out on a fence and a stand of cottonwoods. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and held the letters in her hands, the ones she'd kept, bound with a piece of cord. 16 letters. She'd read them so many times she could recite parts of them from memory. She should have been angrier, she thought, or maybe she was too tired to be angry yet. What she felt was closer to a particular kind of humiliation. Not the sharp public kind, but the slow, private kind that came from discovering you'd believed in something that was never real. That you'd constructed a whole future in your mind based on a collection of words that had cost someone nothing to write. She sat there for a while, long enough for the light outside to shift. Then she untied the cord from around the letters and put them in the small iron stove in the corner. She didn't watch them burn. The next morning she woke early, which she always did, and lay still for a moment listening to the sounds of the town coming alive. Horses, a wagon, someone chopping wood somewhere down the block. She thought about what she had. $43 minus the cost of a room for one night was $39.70. A train ticket back east would cost more than that. A ticket to anywhere would cost close to that. She got up and got dressed. The dining room downstairs was nearly empty. She ordered coffee and the cheapest item on the handwritten menu, which was a plate of eggs and salt pork. And she sat by the window and ate without tasting anything and thought about what a woman with no money and no position and no home did next. She was still thinking about it when she heard the door of the hotel bang open. The sound wasn't alarming exactly, but it was sudden enough that several people looked up. A small boy had come in at a dead run, the way children moved when they were frightened or lost or both. All legs and urgency, no plan. He was maybe 5 years old, with dark hair falling across his forehead and boots that were slightly too big for him, and he was scanning the room with a look of desperate searching that had nothing calculated in it. His eyes found Evelyn. She didn't understand what happened next, only that it happened too fast for her to respond to. The boy crossed the room at a run and flung himself against her, his arms wrapping around her waist, his face pressing against her side. "Mama," he said. The word was muffled but unmistakable. Evelyn sat very still. The boy held on. His small hands gripped the fabric of her dress, and she could feel him shaking, the fine trembling of a child who'd been frightened and had finally found the thing he'd been running toward. "Mama," he said again, quieter this time, and that quietness was somehow worse. Not a demand, but a relief, the sound of someone arriving somewhere they'd been desperate to reach. Everyone in the dining room had stopped what they were doing. Evelyn looked around helplessly. She didn't know this child. She was not his mother, but she also could not make herself push him away. The word he'd said and the way he'd said it had done something to the inside of her chest that she didn't have a name for, and her hands had moved on their own, settling lightly against his back in a gesture she hadn't decided to make. She looked at Agnes, who had appeared in the doorway from the kitchen. Agnes's expression had gone careful. "That's Will Mercer," she said quietly. "Caleb Mercer's boy. He lost his mother 14 months ago." Evelyn looked down at the child pressed against her. He hadn't moved. He was still trembling slightly. His hair was the same dark brown as the dress she was wearing, and when she thought about it later, she would understand, or try to, how a frightened, grieving 5-year-old boy running through a hotel lobby might, for one confused, desperate moment, see what he needed to see instead of what was actually there. "Hey, she said, very softly. She crouched down so that she was at his level, her hands still on his shoulders. "Hey, look at me." He did. His eyes were dark brown and wet at the corners, and when he looked at her directly, she could see the moment he realized. The blink. The small, confused shift in his face as his mind caught up with what his heart had already decided. He didn't run. He just looked at her, and something in his expression shifted from relief to a kind of bewildered, bereft confusion. "I'm sorry," he said. He took a step back. "I thought, you look like—" "It's all right," Evelyn said. He looked at the floor. A small boy remembering to be ashamed of something that wasn't shameful. "What's your name?" she asked. Will. "I'm Evelyn." She waited until he looked at her again. "You don't have to apologize. You were running and you got scared. That happens." He considered this seriously, the way children considered things when they were deciding whether to believe you. Then he said, "My father's outside. He was supposed to wait, but he didn't see where I went." "Shall we go find him then?" Will looked at her for another moment, then nodded. The man on the porch of the hotel was not what she expected, which she'd later recognize as a thing she thought about a great deal that day. The distance between expectation and reality, and how quickly a life could turn on that gap. He was tall, broader through the shoulder than most men she'd known, with the kind of build that came from actual work rather than intention. He had dark hair like his son's, going slightly gray at the temples, and he was wearing a plain work shirt and trousers that had been mended at the knee. His face was not handsome in any polished way. It was weathered and angular, with a jaw that needed shaving and eyes that were doing something complicated when she brought Will out the door. He crossed the distance to his son in 3 strides and crouched down, taking the boy by the shoulders with hands that were large and careful at the same time. "Will, what did I tell you about running off?" "I thought I saw—" Will stopped. "What?" Will looked at Evelyn. He didn't finish. The man followed his son's gaze and stood up. He looked at Evelyn directly, and she had the sense of being assessed quickly and without malice, just a man trying to understand a situation in a hurry. "He ran inside without warning," Evelyn said. "I think he got disoriented. He's fine." The man held her gaze for a moment. "Thank you." He put his hand on Will's shoulder. "Say thank you to the lady, Will." "Thank you," Will said. "Evelyn Hartwell," she said, because it seemed like the right moment for introductions, even if the circumstances were odd. "Caleb Mercer." He shook her hand. His grip was firm and brief, and he let go cleanly. "You're the woman Whitmore was corresponding with." It was not a question. She absorbed the straightforwardness of it and decided she didn't dislike him for it. "I am." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, then, "I'm sorry about what he did. People keep saying that. Does it help?" "Not particularly." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to it. "No, I didn't imagine it would." He looked at her for a moment, and she had the uncomfortable sense that he was seeing the arithmetic of her situation more clearly than she'd have liked. "What are you planning to do?" "I haven't entirely decided." He looked at Will, who was watching the conversation with the particular intensity of a child who understood that something important was happening even if he didn't know what. Then he looked back at her. My housekeeper left in March, he said, went to live with her daughter in Santa Fe. I haven't replaced her. The house is a mess, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't. I've got 5 ranch hands, a 10-year-old horse, 2 dogs, and a boy who just mistook a stranger for his dead mother. He paused. I'm not trying to make you feel obligated. I'm not offering charity. I'd pay you a fair wage, and you'd have your own room. If you want to look at the place before deciding, I can drive you out this afternoon. Evelyn looked at him. She looked at Will, who was still watching her with those dark, serious eyes. She thought about $40 and the price of a train ticket and a room in a city where she knew no one and had no position. What's a fair wage? She said. He told her. It was fair. I'll look at the place this afternoon, she said. The Mercer Ranch was 6 miles outside Red Hollow, at the end of a road that turned to rutted dirt after the first 2 miles and got worse after that. The wagon seat was hard and the springs were not good, and Will sat between them and fell asleep against Evelyn's arm 10 minutes into the drive in the way that children fell asleep, completely, with no apparent transition, one moment alert and the next utterly gone. She looked at the land as they drove. It was genuinely vast. The way frontier land was vast in a way that didn't entirely register until you were actually inside it. The hills rolling away in every direction, covered in grass that had gone tawny with the dry season, broken by stands of cottonwood and pine along the creek lines. The sky was enormous. She'd grown up in Ohio, which had sky in it, but this was different. This was sky as a primary feature of the landscape, the kind that made everything under it feel simultaneously small and significant. You grew up out here? She asked. Born in Tennessee, Caleb said. Came west at 18 with my uncle. He had a small spread about 30 miles north. Worked for him 7 years, then bought my own parcel. How long ago was that? 12 years. She did the arithmetic. He'd built this place from nothing over a decade. She respected that, whatever else. Your wife, she said carefully. Agnes told me she passed 14 months ago. He said it evenly in the way people said things that still hurt but that they'd made their peace with being asked. I'm sorry. He nodded. What was she like? He glanced at her, and she thought maybe she'd overstepped. But he considered the question, and when he answered, she understood that he was someone who didn't reach for the easy answer just to fill silence. She was patient, he said. More patient than me. She had a way of letting things settle instead of forcing them. I never learned to do that. A pause. She was good with Will, better than good. She knew how to talk to him. He looked out at the road ahead. I know how to work alongside him. That's not the same thing. Evelyn looked at the sleeping boy against her arm. The weight of him was unfamiliar, but not uncomfortable. No, she said. It's not. The house was worse than she'd expected, which was saying something since she'd expected it to be bad. It was a 2-story frame house that had once been painted white and was now, in Agnes's phrase, in the process of giving that up. The paint peeling in long curls along the south-facing walls, one shutter hanging at an angle from a broken hinge. The porch boards in need of replacement in at least 3 places. Inside was more organized than the exterior suggested, but still had the particular quality of a house where no one had been paying consistent attention for some time. The kitchen was functional, but cluttered with a year's worth of small disorder. Dishes washed but put away badly, a collection of items that had been set somewhere temporarily and forgotten. A window above the sink with a cracked pane patched with a piece of cloth. She walked through the rooms without saying much. The parlor, the kitchen, the small dining room, the 2 rooms on the ground floor that were being used for storage. Upstairs, Will's room, which was tidier than expected and had drawings tacked to the wall beside his bed. Caleb's room, which she glanced at through the doorway without entering. And the 3rd room at the end of the hall, which had a bed and a washstand and a window that looked east. She stood at that window for a moment. The view was the hills and the sky and a stand of pine along what she guessed was the creek, and late afternoon light was moving across everything in a way that was, she had to admit, genuinely beautiful. She turned around. Caleb was standing in the doorway. The room needs airing, she said. Yes. The kitchen window needs to be repaired. I know. That porch board on the left side, the second one from the door. I nearly went through it. I'll fix it this week. She looked at him. He was watching her with a stillness that she found she didn't mind, which was not how she felt about most men's watching. It was not assessment, exactly, or if it was the kind that was trying to understand something rather than judge it. I'd need Sundays free, she said. Done. And I'm not cooking for ranch hands, just the household. The hands eat at the bunkhouse. All right. She looked at the room again. The dusty floor, the bare mattress, the window with the good view. I'll try it for a month, she said. After a month, we'll both decide if it's working. Caleb nodded. Fair enough. She moved into the room at the end of the hall the following day. She had almost nothing with her. The traveling bag, the books, a small framed photograph of her mother that she set on the washstand. She spent the first afternoon airing the room, sweeping the floor, making the bed with linens she found in the linen press on the landing. She repaired the kitchen window herself, which Caleb saw and didn't comment on, which she took as a good sign. Will watched her from a safe distance for most of the first day. He was not unfriendly, just cautious. The caution of a child who had learned not to attach too quickly to things that might not stay. She understood it and didn't push. When she made supper that evening, she made enough for 4 without thinking about it. And when he came to the table and looked at his plate, and then at her, she just said, "Sit down," in the same voice she used to tell students to open their books. And he sat. That night, after Will was in bed and Caleb was still out in the barn doing whatever it was that kept ranchmen in barns until after dark, she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of her and thought about the distance between where she'd been 3 days ago and where she was now. She'd come to this territory to become a wife. She was instead a housekeeper on someone else's ranch, sleeping in a borrowed room, in a house she had no claim to, in a town that knew her only as the woman who'd been abandoned on the platform. It was not what she'd planned. But she'd been thinking about plans lately, about how much weight she'd put on hers, and how little plans had to say for themselves when they fell apart. What she had, instead of a plan, was a room and a wage and a window that faced east, and a small boy who'd looked at her like she might be something she wasn't, and a man who'd offered her work without making her feel like she should be grateful for it. That was not nothing. It was possibly something, if she was careful with it. She poured the cold coffee into the basin and went to bed. The first week was an exercise in learning systems, how the household worked, what it needed, where things were, and where things should have been, but weren't. Caleb had been doing the minimum necessary for the past year, and it showed, not in filth, but in a kind of accumulated neglect. All the small maintenances that got postponed when the person responsible was also grieving and also running a working ranch and also raising a child alone. She was methodical about it. She'd always been methodical. It was one of the things that had made her a good school teacher. The ability to look at disorder and not be overwhelmed by it, but instead to identify what needed addressing first and work through it in order. She fixed the kitchen first because that was where the household centered itself. Then the main rooms. Then the porch, which she enlisted 2 of the ranch hands to help with on a Thursday afternoon when Caleb was out checking fences, and which earned her a look from him when he returned that was not entirely readable, but was not displeased. She and Will found their way toward each other gradually, in the oblique way that children and adults often did, not through direct conversation, but through adjacency, through shared small moments that accumulated slowly into something like familiarity. She read to him in the evenings, which had not been part of the arrangement, but happened naturally one night when she noticed him sitting alone in the parlor with a book he was clearly too young to read on his own. She sat down next to him and asked what it was, and he showed her, and she said, "Do you want me to read it?" And he shrugged, which was yes, so she did. After that, it was just a thing that happened. He was a quiet child, more interior than most his age, and she recognized in him something she'd seen in herself at that age. A tendency to observe before participating, to wait until he'd understood the shape of a thing before committing to it. He was not sad, exactly, or not only sad. He was careful. He'd learned to be careful. She caught herself, more than once in those first weeks, thinking about what his mother had been like. Patient, Caleb had said. Good with him. She tried not to step into that space uninvited. She was the housekeeper. She was the woman who cooked supper and read at bedtime and kept the house from falling into further disorder. She was not his mother and would not pretend to be. But she was something. She was there. And for a boy who had learned to watch for things leaving, she'd begun to understand that the simple fact of remaining was not nothing. It was at the end of the second week that she first heard Douglas Whitmore's name spoken again. She was in the general store picking up flour and coffee and a few other provisions, and two women near the dry goods shelf were talking in the lowered voices of people who believed they were being discreet. They were not being discreet. Can't imagine what she must feel like, coming all this way. Well, she brought it on herself, didn't she? Advertising yourself like that? No, but to be working out at the Mercer place now, you have to wonder what she's... Evelyn set her purchases on the counter. She looked directly at the two women who had the grace to look uncomfortable. Good afternoon, she said pleasantly. They returned the greeting with varying degrees of discomfort and found reasons to be in a different part of the store. She paid for her provisions and carried them to the wagon and sat for a moment before she picked up the reins. The afternoon was warm, the main street of Red Hollow dusty and sun-bleached, and she was a woman that a whole town had categorized before she'd even had a chance to introduce herself. She'd been categorized before. She'd been the school teacher who'd never married, the woman who was perfectly nice but perhaps a little odd, a little too self-contained. She'd been the too old, the never quite. She knew the particular texture of that kind of categorization, the way it settled over you like dust if you let it. She picked up the reins. She drove back to the ranch. That evening, she made a particularly good supper. Nothing extravagant, just a beef stew with the vegetables from the garden that she'd spent the last week putting back in order, with biscuits from a recipe she'd learned from her mother. Will ate 2 bowls without being asked, and Caleb ate quietly, and afterward said, "That was good," in the way men said things when they meant it, but weren't practiced at saying it. "It was your garden," she said. "It just needed some attention." He looked at her for a moment. Most things do. It was not a profound statement. It was just true. But she thought about it for a while after. She had been at the Mercer Ranch for 19 days when the letter arrived. She didn't know it had arrived at first. It came to the hotel in Red Hollow, addressed to her, general delivery, which meant Agnes held it and sent word with a ranch hand who happened to be in town. The ranch hand passed it to Caleb, who brought it to her in the kitchen after supper with his face carefully neutral. "Came for you at the hotel," he said. He set it on the table. She looked at the handwriting on the envelope and went very still. She recognized it. She had read it 16 times. "Do you want me to—" Caleb started. "No. Thank you." She waited until he'd left the kitchen, and then she sat down and looked at the letter for a long time before she opened it. "Miss Hartwell, I expect you'll be surprised to hear from me, and I won't pretend I don't understand why. I've had some time to think about how things were left, and I believe an explanation is owed. I won't make excuses. What I will say is that the arrangement I'd been offered in Denver was more advantageous than I'd anticipated, and decisions were made quickly and not communicated as they should have been. I find myself now in a position where certain legal questions have arisen regarding our correspondence agreement, and I would like to discuss them with you directly. I'll be passing through Red Hollow in the coming weeks. I hope we can speak like reasonable people. Douglas Whitmore." She read it twice. Then she set it down on the table with the careful movements of someone handling something that needed to be handled carefully. The arrangement I'd been offered in Denver, as if she had been an arrangement, as if the 800 miles and the 9 months of letters and the $40 had been a transaction that had simply been superseded by a better one. Certain legal questions regarding our correspondence agreement. She did not know what that meant. She didn't know enough about frontier contract law to know whether correspondence between a mail-order bride and a prospective husband constituted a legal agreement, or what claiming it did would accomplish. But she knew what it felt like. It felt like a man who had already wronged her deciding that wasn't enough, and that he needed to come back and wrong her in a new way. She sat in the kitchen for a long time after that. The fire in the stove ticked and settled. Outside, the night insects were loud against the silence. She folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket. She was not going to run. She'd already made that decision without knowing she was making it. That first day when she'd stood in Agnes's hotel and felt the arithmetic of her situation and decided, without drama, to stay and work with what she had. She was not a woman who ran from things, but she was also not a woman who was unprepared. Whatever Douglas Whitmore thought he was coming back to, he was going to find something different than what he'd left. She got up and started washing the supper dishes, and by the time she was done, she had the beginning of a plan. The plan, such as it was, began with information. Evelyn was not impulsive by nature. She had spent 9 years in a schoolroom learning to read situations before she responded to them, to understand what a child actually needed before deciding how to address it, to separate the presenting problem from the real one. She applied the same discipline now. Before she could do anything useful about Douglas Whitmore, she needed to understand what he actually wanted, and whether his vague reference to legal questions regarding their correspondence was a genuine threat or simply a man trying to frighten her into a posture of guilt. She started with Agnes. She drove into Red Hollow on a Wednesday morning, ostensibly to pick up provisions, and spent 20 minutes in the hotel sitting room with Agnes over coffee. Agnes was, as Evelyn had already begun to understand, the kind of woman who knew everything that happened in a small town, not through gossip, but through attention. The type who listened more than she talked and remembered more than she let on. "Has anyone heard from him?" Evelyn asked. "Since he left, I mean, not just rumors." Agnes wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Martin Greeley got a letter. Martin runs the feed store. Whitmore owed him money on a credit account, and apparently the letter addressed that." "What did it say?" "Martin told me Whitmore said he'd be settling his accounts personally when he came back through." Agnes paused. "He's coming back then. That's confirmed." "He wrote to me," Evelyn said. She didn't produce the letter. She'd decided not to show it to anyone until she understood it better. "He mentioned legal matters." Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then, "You should talk to Samuel Holt." "Who's that?" "He's not exactly a lawyer. He did 2 years of legal study in St. Louis before he came out here. He handles what passes for legal business in this part of the territory. Deeds, disputes, that kind of thing." She looked at Evelyn steadily. "He's a fair man, and he knows more about how these correspondence agreements get treated in the courts than anyone else in 20 miles. Evelyn found Samuel Holt in a small office above the feed store, a narrow room with a desk overwhelmed by papers and 2 chairs that didn't match, and a window overlooking the alley. He was a thin man in his mid-40s with spectacles and the permanent, slightly distracted air of someone whose mind was always partly somewhere else. He read the letter carefully and read it again and then set it on the desk and looked at his hands. "The phrase he's using, correspondence agreement, that's deliberate," Holt said. "He's suggesting that your exchange of letters constituted a binding contract of some kind. That by writing to him and agreeing to come out here to marry him, you entered into an agreement, and that by not, well, he'd need a creative version of events to make this work. But the argument would be that there was a breach." Evelyn looked at him. "He abandoned me. He left 6 days before I arrived." "I know that, you know that, Agnes knows that, and Martin Greeley knows that, and I suspect half the town knows that." Holt picked up the letter again. "But what matters in a court proceeding is what can be demonstrated. And a man with money can sometimes demonstrate things more effectively than a woman without it." "Is there actually a legal case here? Against me?" Holt considered. "In a frontier territory court? Possibly. Not a strong one, but not zero." He looked at her over the top of his spectacles. "What I think he's actually doing is trying to create enough legal noise that you'll leave. He doesn't want to go to court. Courts create records, and a public proceeding where witnesses testify about what he did would be damaging for him. What he wants is for you to be frightened enough to disappear, which solves his problem without any of the mess." Evelyn sat with that for a moment. "He sold his ranch and left. What problem does he have?" "Reputation. He still has business interests in this territory. He's not gone for good. Men like that rarely are. He sold one property, but there are people here who know him, owe him, have dealings with him. A woman who stays and talks is a problem. A woman who's been scared off is not." She drove back to the ranch thinking about that. The late morning light was flat and dusty, the road hard and dry beneath the wheels. Will was at the schoolhouse in town. Caleb drove him in on Monday mornings and collected him on Friday afternoons. And the ranch was quiet when she returned, only the sounds of the hands working somewhere beyond the barn. She unhitched the horse and brushed her down and put her in the paddock, and then she stood by the paddock fence for a while looking at the hills. The dry grass moved in a light wind. A hawk was working a slow circle against the blue sky about a half-mile out, tilting on the updrafts with a patience that was almost architectural. She was not going to leave. That remained true, but she needed to think carefully about what staying actually required. Caleb noticed something had changed. He was not, by his own admission, a perceptive man in the conventional sense. He would not have claimed to read people well or to catch the subtle shifts in atmosphere that some people were naturally attuned to. But he'd spent 12 years watching land and weather and animals and learning to identify the small signs that indicated something larger was developing beneath the surface. And he applied the same attention to the people around him, whether he meant to or not. She was quieter at supper. Not unhappy quiet. She was contained by nature, and he'd learned the difference. But thinking quiet, the kind of silence that had weight in it. He waited until Will was in bed and she was finishing in the kitchen, and then he leaned against the doorframe and said, "You going to tell me what the letter said?" She didn't turn around. She was drying a dish that was already dry. "You read the return address. I saw the handwriting matched what was on the hotel register from when he used to come to town." She set the dish down and turned around. In the lamplight, her face was composed but not closed. She was letting him see that she was thinking hard about something, which he'd come to understand was a form of trust from her, since she didn't do it often. "He's coming back through," she said. "He suggests there are legal matters between us." Caleb said nothing for a moment. He was processing the information and also managing what he felt about it, which was several things simultaneously and not all of them simple. He'd known Whitmore. Not well, but enough. He'd bought land from the man. He hadn't liked him particularly, had found him smooth in a way that was adjacent to dishonest. But he'd respected that the transaction was straightforward, and the papers were in order and the deal was fair. He hadn't known about the correspondence with Evelyn until after the fact, when the whole town was talking about it. What he felt about the letter was anger, which surprised him with its clarity. "Legal matters," he said. "He's implying I breached a contract by not going through with the marriage, which is—" She paused, and he saw her deciding how hard to be with it, "which is a creative interpretation of the facts." "He left." "Yes." "He left 6 days before you arrived." "Also yes." Caleb pushed himself off the doorframe. He walked to the table and sat down, which was something he did when he needed to think without pacing, because pacing made him look agitated, and he didn't like looking agitated in front of people. "What did Holt say?" She blinked. "You know I went to see him?" "Greeley mentioned it when I was at the feed store this afternoon." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down too, which he took as a sign that she'd decided to have the conversation properly. She told him what Holt had said, the substance of it, clearly, without embellishment. She was good at that, he'd noticed. She didn't editorialize when she was reporting facts. She kept the interpretation separate from the information. When she finished, he sat quietly for a moment. "He wants to scare you off," he said. "That's Holt's read." "It's mine too." He looked at her. "Are you scared?" "I'm annoyed," she said, which was honest, and also, he thought, not the whole answer. "Evelyn," she looked at him steadily. "I'm a woman alone in a town where I know almost no one, where everyone already has a story about me, and a man with money is threatening to take me to court over something I didn't do." A beat. "Of course I'm scared, but being scared and deciding to run are different things." He nodded. He respected that answer. He respected it more than a flat denial would have, because it was true, and she knew he'd know it was true, and she said it anyway. "When is he coming?" he asked. "He didn't say. Soon." He put his hands flat on the table. "You should know. Whatever he decides to try, it doesn't affect your position here. You work for me. He doesn't have anything to do with that." She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you. I'm not saying it to be decent. I'm saying it because it's a fact you should have." The corner of her mouth moved in a way that might have been the beginning of something. "I understand the difference," she said. The next week and a half was a particular kind of tense quiet, the kind that had a specific pressure to it, like the sky before a storm that was coming but hadn't arrived yet. Evelyn kept working. She always kept working. It was one of the things about her he'd noticed earliest, that she treated idleness as something to be solved, that she moved through a house the way he moved through his land, looking for what needed doing and doing it without announcing it. She'd transformed the kitchen in ways he was still noticing. The pantry had been reorganized so that he could find things. The shelf above the stove that had accumulated 3 years of miscellaneous hardware and 2 dead candles and a broken leather strap was now clear. The window she'd repaired let in clean light in the mornings. Small things, none of them dramatic, all of them adding up to a house that felt inhabited in a way it hadn't since Clara. He didn't say this to her. He wasn't sure how to say it without it sounding like something he didn't mean for it to sound like. So he said other things instead, practical things, about the pantry and the shelf and the window, and she received them in the same register they were offered, which was how they mostly communicated, practically and honestly and without much ceremony, and he had decided he was grateful for that. Will had loosened toward her in a way that he watched with a complicated feeling. Not jealousy. He didn't think it was that. Something more like relief and grief at the same time. The two feelings running alongside each other the way creek channels sometimes ran parallel before joining. His son was 5 years old, and he had gone 14 months without a woman in the house who sat with him or read to him or asked him how he felt about things. And watching him come back toward that, carefully. The way he did everything, but unmistakably, was both exactly what Caleb had hoped for and also, somehow, harder to watch than he'd anticipated. He'd found them one evening on the porch steps, Will talking about something at the schoolhouse. A disagreement with another boy over something that involved a stick and a frog, the specifics unclear but the injustice apparently acute, and Evelyn listening with her full attention, not the half attention adults gave children when they were thinking about other things. She'd asked a question. Will had answered it. She'd asked another. He'd watched for a minute from the barn doorway without either of them seeing him, and then he'd gone back inside because it felt like something private. He'd thought about Clara after that. He did that sometimes, came around a corner of his day and found her there, not in a grief way anymore, but in a this is what things are way. Clara had known how to listen to Will. It was a specific skill she'd had that he'd admired and never fully figured out how to replicate. He'd tried, after she died, to be both things, the father who worked alongside his son, and the parent who knew how to sit still and hear the small things, and he'd managed it imperfectly, which was the truth of it. You did what you could, and it was never quite enough, and you kept going. He was thinking about this on a Thursday morning when one of his hands, a man named Pete, came to find him at the corral fence and said there was a man at the gate asking for the woman who worked there. Caleb looked up. "What kind of man?" he said. Pete shrugged. "Dressed well. Came in a hired rig from town." Caleb handed Pete the fence post he'd been holding and walked toward the gate. Suck. Douglas Whitmore had the particular quality of men who had once been attractive and knew it, and had been coasting on the memory of it for longer than was wise. He was somewhere in his late 30s, well-dressed in the way that announced money without taste, the clothes too new, the boots too polished for the dust of a ranch road. He had a broad, confident face and the kind of easy posture that came from a life of things working out, and he was standing beside a hired carriage with his hands in his jacket pockets, like a man who was comfortable everywhere he stood. He saw Caleb coming and smiled. It was a practice smile, warm on the surface. "Mercer," he said. "Good to see you again. Place is looking well." "Whitmore." Caleb stopped a few feet from him. "You're here to see my housekeeper." If the phrasing bothered him, he didn't show it. "I'm here to speak with Miss Hartwell. Yes, private matter. Won't take long." "She know you're coming?" I rode ahead. "She'll decide if she wants to speak with you," Caleb said. "Wait here." He didn't offer the man water or a seat. He turned and walked back to the house. Evelyn was in the kitchen. She looked up when he came in, and he could see she already knew from his face that something had happened. "He's at the gate," Caleb said. She went still for a moment. Just a moment. Then she untied her apron and folded it over the chair back, which was such a deliberate action, so unhurried that he felt something shift in his chest. Something like respect, but more immediate than that. "All right," she said. "You don't have to go out there." "I know." She smoothed her dress. "I'm going anyway." He walked with her to the gate. He didn't ask if that was all right. If she didn't want him there, she'd have said so. Whitmore's face when he saw Evelyn coming was harder to read. The smile was still there, but something underneath it had recalibrated. A small adjustment, a taking of measure. "Miss Hartwell," he said. "You're looking well." "Mr. Whitmore." She stopped at a comfortable distance. Her voice was level. "You mentioned legal matters." He glanced at Caleb. Perhaps we could speak privately. We can speak here, she said. He absorbed this, looked at Caleb again, then back at her, and decided not to push it. I've spoken with my legal representative in Denver. Our correspondence constitutes a formal arrangement under territorial law, and your failure to honor— I arrived, Evelyn said. I arrived on the date we agreed. You were gone. Circumstances changed. What circumstances? He shifted slightly. Business opportunities arose that required immediate action. I communicated this as soon as— You communicated nothing. Agnes sent a telegram to my address in Ohio after you'd left. It arrived after I did. Her voice remained even. It did not rise or sharpen. She was not performing calm. She was actually calm, or something close enough to it that the difference didn't matter. You left. You did not notify me. I arrived in Red Hollow with $43 and nowhere to stay, and the whole town knowing I'd been abandoned. If anyone breached an agreement, it was you. Whitmore's jaw tightened slightly. Miss Hartwell, I understand you're upset. I'm not upset, she said. I'm correcting an inaccurate legal theory. He looked at her for a long moment. Caleb stood beside her and said nothing. He'd decided this was her conversation to have and that his job was simply to be present, which was, he suspected, exactly what she needed him for. You'd be wise, Whitmore said, his voice dropping to something quieter and less agreeable, to think carefully about a public proceeding. Courts in this territory are not sympathetic to— To what? She said. He stopped. Finish the thought, she said. I'd like to know exactly what you were going to say. He didn't finish it. He looked at her and then at Caleb and then back at her, and something passed across his face that might have been reassessment. I'll be in Red Hollow for several days, he said. I hope you'll reconsider your position. I'll consider it, she said. I'll let you know what I decide. He got back into the carriage. The driver turned the horses. They drove back down the road toward town. She watched until the rig disappeared around the bend. Then she let out a breath. The first uncontrolled thing she'd done in the entire exchange. He'll be back, Caleb said. I know. He's going to make trouble. I know that too. She looked at the road for another moment, then turned toward the house. I'm going to need to talk to Holt again. What Evelyn did over the following days was what she'd always done with a problem she couldn't avoid. She worked it methodically, from the outside in, building her understanding of the territory before deciding on a course of action. She drove to town 3 times that week. The first time, she spoke with Samuel Holt for over an hour, going through the specifics of the correspondence, what the letters had said, what agreements had been implied versus stated, what evidence existed of Whitmore's departure and its timing. Holt listened carefully and asked precise questions, and at the end said, You have a defensible position. I won't tell you more than that, because frontier courts are unpredictable, but you're not without standing. The second time, she spoke with Agnes, who had information she hadn't offered at first but offered now, when it became clear that Whitmore had returned and was talking to people in town. He'd been to see Martin Greeley and to 2 other men who'd had dealings with him. He'd visited the land office. He was, Agnes said, making himself visible and comfortable in a deliberate way, reminding people of his presence and his connections before whatever he intended to do next. He's been talking, Agnes said carefully, about you, about the arrangement, and about what kind of woman would travel 800 miles to marry a man she'd only known through letters. Evelyn looked at her. He's questioning my character. He's being subtle about it, but yes. She sat with that for a moment. The specific cruelty of it was not lost on her. That the man who had deceived her was now, in the same breath, implying that the deception was somehow evidence of her being unworthy of better treatment. It was a closed loop, a tidy piece of logic that worked entirely in his favor if no one examined it too closely. All right, she said. All right, Agnes repeated. It means I know what he's doing. That's useful. The third visit, she stopped at the schoolhouse at the end of the day when the children were being collected. She wanted to see Will, not for any specific reason, just to see him. He came out with his small bag on his back and saw her at the fence and walked over without running, which she knew meant he was around other children and exercising his dignity. When he reached her, he stood close enough to her arm that they were almost touching. How was it? She said. Fine, he said, which was what children said when it was actually fine. Not when it was bad, When it was bad, they also said fine, but differently. She drove him home. He fell asleep again 10 minutes in, the same way he had the first time, completely and without ceremony. She drove the last 4 miles with his weight against her side and the horses moving steady beneath the empty sky, and thought about the shape of her situation. Douglas Whitmore wanted her gone. He was using money and reputation and legal threat, and now, apparently, the softer weapon of social insinuation. The slow poisoning of how a community saw you. The drip of implication that over time was sometimes more effective than a direct attack. She was not going to disappear. She had decided that. But deciding it and holding it were different things, and she was honest enough with herself to know that she was going to need more than personal resolve if he pushed this to a public confrontation. What she had: Holt's assessment of her legal standing, Agnes's information, the fact that several people in Red Hollow had witnessed Whitmore's departure and its circumstances, and Caleb, who hadn't asked to be involved in any of this and was involved anyway, standing beside her at the gate without being asked. She thought about that as she drove. She thought about what it meant that he'd been there without being asked, and what it meant that he'd said nothing through the whole confrontation. Not nothing because he had nothing to say. She'd understood that much about him by now, but nothing because he understood that it wasn't his conversation to have. He'd been present without taking over. She hadn't expected that from a man. She wasn't sure she'd entirely known it was a thing men could do. She was thinking about this when Will stirred beside her and opened his eyes and looked around at the familiar road with the slightly confused expression of someone waking in a moving vehicle. "Almost home?" she said. He closed his eyes again. Not sleeping, just resting. Home. She'd said it without thinking, and it had come out of her mouth as naturally as if she'd been saying it for years, as if the word belonged to this road and these hills and this particular late afternoon light that was turning the dry grass gold along the ridgeline. She didn't take it back. She kept it. Caleb found her that evening after Will was asleep, sitting on the porch steps in the dark. She had a cup of something warm in her hands. Tea, probably. And she was looking out at the barn, which was a dark shape against a slightly less dark sky. He sat down on the step beside her. Not next to her exactly. There was a foot of space between them, but in the same general posture, both of them looking at the barn. "He's been talking to people in town," she said without preamble. "I know Pete heard some of it when he was in getting supplies. About me." "I heard." She was quiet for a moment. "Does that bother you? That someone working for you is the subject of that kind of talk?" He thought about it honestly, which was how he tried to think about things that deserved honest thinking. "It bothers me because it's not fair," he said. "Not because of how it reflects on me." She turned her head to look at him. He could see her face clearly enough in the starlight. Her expression was evaluating, not suspicious, the way she looked when she was deciding whether something was true. "All right," she said. "What does Holt say?" "That I have standing, that it's not a hopeless case." She looked back at the barn. "He's going to push this. He didn't come back here to leave quietly. He came back because he wants me to feel like I don't have the right to stay." Caleb turned the thought over. "Does he know about the women?" She looked at him. "What women?" Greeley mentioned something, said he'd heard, from his cousin in Denver apparently, that Whitmore had been corresponding with more than one woman at the same time. Not just you, at least 2 others that he knew of. The silence that followed had a particular quality. She was processing it, but she was also, he could see it, putting it in a specific place alongside other things she already knew. "If that's true," she said slowly. "It could be documented," he said, "if the other women can be reached." "That's a large if." "Greeley's cousin is in Denver. He might know how to find them." Caleb looked at her. "I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you what I know." She sat with it for a moment. The insects were loud around them. Somewhere out beyond the barn, one of the dogs barked once and went quiet. "You keep doing that," she said. "Doing what?" "Telling me things without telling me what to do with them." He thought about that. "You don't need to be told what to do," he said. "You need information. Those are different things." She looked at him for a long moment. He was aware of the gap between them on the step, the foot of space that was both nothing and not nothing. "Caleb," she said. "Evelyn?" She almost smiled. Almost. I'm going to fight him. I know. It's going to get ugly before it gets better. Most things do. She turned back to the barn. She drank from her cup. The warm night settled around them both. After a while, she said, "Your cousin in Greeley, can he find out quickly?" "He's not my cousin. He's Greeley's cousin." "Can you ask Greeley to ask his cousin?" "Yes." "Will you?" He looked at her. "Already planned to," he said. She nodded. She didn't thank him. He was glad she didn't. He didn't want her thanks for this. He wanted her to know it was simply a thing being done because it needed doing. The same way you fixed a fence or mended a roof or stood beside someone at a gate when a man with rehearsed smiles came to make her feel small. He'd been on his own land for 12 years, and he knew every inch of it. And in the past 3 weeks, Evelyn Hartwell had been walking through his house and his days with her sleeves rolled up and her attention fully applied. And something had shifted in the atmosphere of the place, in a way he didn't entirely know how to articulate, but that he felt clearly, the way you felt a change in the wind on your face before you could name the direction. He was not going to say anything about that. Not now, and possibly not ever, or at least not until things were settled and she had the freedom to respond without any pressure of obligation attached to it. She worked for him. Her position here was precarious in ways that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with Whitmore. He would not add to her complications. But he stayed on the step until she went inside, and he was the last one awake in the house that night, sitting in the dark with the sound of the land around him, thinking about what was coming. The letter from Denver arrived on a Friday, 9 days after Caleb had asked Martin Greeley to write to his cousin. Greeley brought it out to the ranch himself, which told Evelyn something before she'd even read a word, that whatever was in it was important enough that he hadn't wanted to wait for the next time someone from the Mercer place came into town. He was a quiet man, Greeley, mid-50s, with a gray beard and the deliberate movements of someone who had learned not to hurry through things. He declined coffee and stood in the kitchen doorway while she read. There had been 3 women, not 2. 3, including Evelyn, corresponding with Douglas Whitmore simultaneously over a period of roughly 8 months. Greeley's cousin in Denver had spoken to one of them directly, a woman named Ruth Alderman, a widow from Kansas who had exchanged letters with Whitmore for 6 months before he had simply stopped writing, 3 weeks before he'd departed Red Hollow. Ruth Alderman was willing to provide a written account of the correspondence. She had kept the letters. The third woman, Greeley's cousin believed, was somewhere in Missouri, though her name wasn't yet confirmed. Evelyn read the letter twice. Then she folded it along its original creases and held it in both hands and looked at the far wall of the kitchen for a moment. "He was running a system," she said. Greeley nodded. "Looks that way." She thought about the 16 letters she'd burned in the iron stove on her first night in Red Hollow. She thought about the particular quality of them, the thoughtfulness she'd attributed to a lonely man's honesty. She thought about how long it must have taken him to write 3 versions of the same performance, how much of his time had gone into constructing intimacy as a strategy rather than experiencing it as a feeling. "Thank you," she said to Greeley, "and thank your cousin. Ruth Alderman said to tell you—" He paused. "She said to tell you she's sorry she didn't know sooner. She said if she'd known about you, she'd have written you herself." Evelyn looked at him. "Tell her I said the same." After Greeley left, she sat at the kitchen table for a long time. She wasn't processing grief exactly. She'd already done most of that in the weeks since arriving, in the small private hours when she was honest with herself about what she'd lost. What she was processing was something colder and more useful. Anger fully arrived at last, no longer theoretical, and beneath it, a clarity about what she intended to do with what she now knew. Caleb came in from the south pasture just after noon, dusty and tired, and found her at the table with Holt's earlier notes and Greeley's letter laid out in front of her. He read the situation from her face before she said a word. Not the specific content of it, but the general shape. He washed his hands at the basin and poured himself a cup of water from the pitcher and sat down across from her. She told him what Greeley had found. He listened without interrupting, which was how he listened to things that mattered. When she finished, he turned the cup in his hands and was quiet for a moment. 3, he said. At minimum. He was doing this at the same time he was selling the ranch. He set the cup down. He wasn't just getting cold feet. He was liquidating, clearing out completely and leaving 3 women with nothing to show for it. That's how I read it. Holt needs to see this. I'm going to town this afternoon. He nodded. He looked at the papers on the table, then at her. I'll drive you. You don't have to. I know. He stood and put on his hat. I'll have Pete handle the afternoon work. Give me 20 minutes. She didn't argue with them. She'd been learning in these past weeks to distinguish between the offers that were charity and the ones that were simply practical. And Caleb made almost exclusively practical offers, extended without sentiment and without expectation. It was a thing she had come to trust about him, the way you trusted a fence that had been properly built. Not because it was impressive to look at, but because it held. They drove to Red Hollow in the late afternoon light, Will not with them since it was a school day, and Pete's wife had agreed to collect him. The conversation in the wagon was sparse, comfortable spare, not uncomfortable. Caleb told her something about the south fence he'd been repairing, a detail about the way the posts had heaved with last winter's frost. She asked a question. He answered it. They were not talking around things. They were simply talking like two people who had gotten used to each other's company without making a production of it. She noticed this. She noticed it the way you noticed weather when it was particularly clear. Holt read the letter from Denver with both hands flat on his desk and his expression going through several stages of revision. 3, he said. He looked up at Evelyn. You're certain this is reliable? Greeley's cousin spoke with the woman in Kansas directly. She has the letters. She's willing to give a written account. Holt removed his spectacles and cleaned them with his shirt hem, which she'd come to understand was what he did when he was thinking hard. This changes the character of the case significantly, he said. A single breach of correspondence could be argued as a failure of nerve, a changed circumstance, any number of sympathetic constructions. But a pattern of simultaneous correspondence with multiple women, combined with the liquidation of property. He replaced his spectacles. That's not cold feet. That's deliberate misrepresentation for personal gain, which in a territorial court reads very differently. Can it be used defensively? Evelyn asked. If he brings a case against me. Defensively and offensively, Holt said. If he files against you, this evidence doesn't just undermine his claim. It invites the court to examine his conduct, and if his conduct is what this letter suggests, he would know that better than anyone. He leaned back in his chair. He's counting on you not having this. He came back here assuming you were isolated and uninformed, which means... He doesn't know about Ruth Alderman, Evelyn said. Presumably not, or not that you know about her. Caleb, standing by the office window, said, What's your read on whether he actually files? Holt considered. Before this letter, I'd have said maybe 40%. He wanted to frighten her, but a public proceeding carries risk for him too. He tapped the letter with one finger. After this, I think he files. Precisely because he doesn't know about this yet. He's probably spent the last 10 days building his position in town, talking to people, establishing the version of events he wants people to believe. He's committed to a course now. Backing down quietly would look like weakness. So he's going to court, Caleb said. I think so, yes. Evelyn sat with that. She felt the particular physical sensation of a decision crystallizing. Not a dramatic feeling, not the rush of resolve that stories described, but something quieter and heavier. The simple feeling of a path becoming clear because all the other paths had closed. Then we prepare for court, she said. Holt looked at her over his spectacles. That means getting a written statement from Ruth Alderman. It means identifying the third woman if we can. It means lining up witnesses who can confirm the timeline of his departure from Red Hollow. Specifically, who saw him leave and when. Agnes, Evelyn said immediately. The station master would have his departure date on record. Martin Greeley saw him settle accounts. She was already organizing it in her head, the same way she organized the house, identifying what existed, what was missing, what order things needed to happen in. I can reach out to the station master tomorrow, Holt said. Getting the formal record is cleaner if it comes from me. Agnes will speak on her own. I don't think she needs much encouragement. He made a note. The harder piece is Ruth Alderman's statement. We'd need it here within 2 weeks if he moves quickly. She's willing, Evelyn said. Greeley's cousin said she's willing. Willing isn't the same as fast. She's in Kansas, which means mail turnaround. I'll write to her tonight, Evelyn said. I'll tell her exactly what we need and why we need it quickly. She kept his letters. She understood what he was. She paused. She'll do it quickly. Holt looked at her for a moment. You sound very certain about a woman you've never met. She said she was sorry she didn't know about me sooner. She said if she had, she'd have written me herself. Evelyn looked at her hands, then back at Holt. That's not what someone says who's going to be slow about helping. He nodded slowly. All right. On the drive back to the ranch, the sun was going down behind the western hills, long orange light cutting across the road. Caleb drove, and she sat beside him, and did not speak for the first several miles, and he let her be quiet, which was one of the things she'd come to understand was a form of consideration specific to him. After a while, she said, Are you all right with this? With all of this? He glanced at her. What do you mean? I mean, your name is in it now. People in town know you're involved. Whitmore knows it. When this goes to court, I'll testify to what I saw at my gate, he said. That's not complicated. He could make things difficult for you. Business things. He has connections. Evelyn. He said her name in the particular way he had, not sharply, just with a quiet finality that indicated he was about to say something directly. I know what I'm getting into. You don't need to protect me from it. She looked at him. You've been doing that, he said, giving me the option to step back, framing things so I have an easy exit if I want one. She didn't deny it. I don't want one, he said. The horses moved. The light was almost gone now, leaving the sky a deep bruised blue above the hills. Why? She said. It was a direct question, and she asked it the same way she asked everything, without elaborate approach, just the thing itself. He thought about it for long enough that she began to wonder if she'd made a mistake asking. Then he said, Because what he did was wrong, and because you're... He stopped. Started again. You came here and you worked. You didn't complain. You didn't make anyone feel sorry for you. You fixed the window and the porch and the pantry, and you read to my son, and you didn't ask for anything except what was already in the agreement. He was looking at the road. A man who does what he did, to a person like that, I'm not going to step back from that. That's not how I'm built. She was quiet. That's not just about you, he added, which she understood was him making sure she didn't misread it as something he wasn't ready to call it yet. It would apply to anyone in the same situation. I know, she said, which was true, and which was also, she thought, part of why she believed the rest of it. Whitmore filed 4 days later. Holt came out to the ranch to tell her because it was that kind of news, the kind that deserved a person's face and not a written note. He arrived in mid-morning, tied his horse, and came to the kitchen door, and she read it in the way he knocked, careful and deliberate, before he said a word. The filing claimed breach of written marriage agreement seeking financial damages for what Whitmore's petition described as abandonment of a formally arranged match, resulting in material and reputational harm to the plaintiff. He was asking for $200. Evelyn read the copy Holt had brought. She read it carefully, all the way to the end. Reputational harm, she said. Yes. He has the vocabulary inverted. He does. But it's in a document now, which means it will be read by people. Holt sat down at the table. She poured him coffee without asking. He always took it when offered, and they'd long since moved past the formality of asking. The hearing is in 3 weeks. Judge Alderman is traveling a circuit and won't be in Red Hollow until then. Alderman, she said. Different Alderman, Holt said. Not related to our Ruth as far as I know. Judge Henry Alderman. He's fair. He doesn't like it when his time is wasted with weak cases, and he particularly doesn't like it when money is being used to pressure people who don't have it. He wrapped his hands around the cup. That's not a guarantee, that's just context. What do I need to do between now and 3 weeks from now? Keep building the file. Ruth Alderman's statement, the station master's record, Agnes's account. Anyone else who can speak to the timeline or to Whitmore's character. He paused. And prepare your own testimony. My own. You'll need to stand in court and speak, not just have evidence submitted on your behalf. A judge wants to see the person at the center of a case, wants to hear them. He looked at her. You'll need to tell your story clearly, without anger and without apology. Can you do that? She thought about standing up in the dining room of the Millhaven schoolhouse and speaking to parents about their children. She thought about sitting across from Whitmore at the gate with Caleb beside her. She thought about every time she'd had to hold herself together in a room where someone had decided before she'd spoken that she wasn't worth listening to. Yes, she said. The 3 weeks that followed were the most complicated of Evelyn's time in Red Hollow, and in some ways the most clarifying. Ruth Alderman's statement arrived in 11 days, which was faster than either she or Holt had hoped. It was 5 pages, handwritten in a clear, careful hand, and it documented 6 months of correspondence with Whitmore in detail. The promises made, the plans discussed, the abrupt cessation of letters, and Ruth's eventual discovery through a mutual contact in Denver that Whitmore had left the territory entirely. It was a precise, unemotional account that was, for that reason, more devastating than a distressed one would have been. Ruth Alderman had not written it from grief. She had written it from a cold, clear anger that had been given months to settle into something harder and more durable. There was a note in the end of the letter, separate from the formal statement. Miss Hartwell, I hope this helps. I hope you win. Write to me when it's over. Evelyn sat with the note for a moment, then put it away carefully in the same place she kept the few things she considered worth keeping. The third woman, the one in Missouri, was found through Greeley's cousin's additional efforts. Her name confirmed as Dorothy Vance, a schoolteacher not unlike Evelyn herself. Dorothy Vance was harder to reach, the mail slower, and her statement arrived only 2 days before the hearing. Barely in time. Barely enough, but in time. Meanwhile, the town of Red Hollow was sorting itself out. It did this the way small towns always did when a conflict involved people they knew. Slowly, with much private conversation, and eventually along lines that more or less reflected people's actual values once the social pressure of remaining neutral had eased. Agnes had never been neutral. Martin Greeley moved from neutral to openly supportive once Evelyn visited him and explained carefully and without dramatics what the Denver letter had revealed. The station master, a taciturn man named Briggs who kept meticulous records, confirmed the date of Whitmore's departure in writing without being asked his opinion, which was the most neutral thing he did and also one of the most useful. There were people who remained skeptical. There were people who thought Evelyn had brought trouble into a peaceful community that had no need of it. There was a woman, the wife of one of Whitmore's former business associates, who said in the general store, loudly enough to be heard, that no decent woman traveled 800 miles to marry a man she'd never met, and that whatever had happened was the natural consequence of that kind of desperation. Evelyn heard this secondhand from Pete, who told Caleb, who told her that evening on the porch in the careful way he delivered difficult information. Directly, without decoration, and with his eyes steady on her face so she'd know he wasn't embarrassed by any of it. She received it the same way. She's not entirely wrong that it was unorthodox, Evelyn said. She's wrong about the rest of it. I know. She looked at the hills. People need a story that makes sense to them, a version where the outcome is somehow deserved. It's easier. That doesn't make it right. No, she said. It doesn't. He was quiet for a moment, then, Will came home from school today and told me a boy in his class said his housekeeper was in trouble with the law. She turned to look at him. He told the boy that was wrong, Caleb said, in the specific terms of a 5-year-old, which involved some inaccuracies, but the intention was correct. She felt something move in her chest. What did he say exactly? He said, Evelyn didn't do anything. She's the one who got left. Then apparently he pushed the other boy, which I had to address, but she laughed. It came out of her unexpectedly, the real kind of laugh, not polite or managed. You had to scold him for being right. I had to scold him for the pushing, Caleb said. There was something happening around his eyes that she'd come to recognize as what happened when he was trying not to smile. I was internally supportive of the substance. She looked at him for a moment. He looked back. There was a thing building in the space between them that they had both, with a kind of unspoken mutual care, been leaving alone. She was aware of it the way you were aware of a window left open in another room. Not urgent, not demanding attention, just there. A presence rather than a problem. She did not have the freedom to examine it properly yet, and she was honest enough with herself to understand why. Not just because of her situation, which was still unresolved, but because she had spent 9 years in Millhaven learning to be alone, and she did not entirely trust her own judgment about what she was feeling and whether it was what she thought it was, or just the warmth of someone being consistently kind to her when she was afraid. She looked away, back at the hills. He did the same. 3 weeks ago I didn't know your name, she said. I know. This is a strange situation. Most situations are, he said, if you look at them closely enough. She thought about that. It was the kind of thing that sounded obvious when you said it, but wasn't when you actually applied it. So, the night before the hearing, she could not sleep. She lay in the room at the end of the hall and listened to the house settling and thought about the morning. She was not afraid of speaking. Holt had been right that she could do it, and she had prepared carefully, had thought through her testimony until it was clean and direct and honest. She was not afraid of Whitmore exactly either. She had looked at him at the gate and understood what he was. And understanding a thing took away some of its power. What she was afraid of, if she was honest, was the specific vulnerability of a public proceeding in a small town where half the people already had a story about her and the other half were waiting to see how this played out before deciding. She was afraid of standing up in a room and saying true things and having them not be believed because she understood, clearly, without bitterness, that sometimes true things weren't believed when said by people without money or men beside them, or social standing, or any of the other things that caused people to be believed in rooms that made decisions. She got up at 4 a.m. and went downstairs and lit the lamp and sat at the kitchen table and did what she'd always done when she was afraid and couldn't sleep. She made a list, not of things to do, but of things that were true. Facts arranged in order. She had arrived in Red Hollow on the date agreed. Fact. Whitmore had left 6 days before her arrival. Fact. He had sent no word. Fact, documented by Agnes and by the station master's records. He had been simultaneously corresponding with 2 other women. Fact, documented by written statements. He had sold his property and departed in a pattern consistent with deliberate financial extraction rather than changed circumstances. Fact, arguable. She had worked for 3 weeks on the Mercer Ranch. She had a position, a wage, a room, a household that was better ordered than when she'd arrived. She had done nothing wrong and had nothing to apologize for, and she intended to say so in a room full of people and let them decide what they believed. She folded the list and put it in her pocket, where it would stay during the hearing, not to refer to, just to have. She was still sitting at the table when she heard footsteps on the stairs. She didn't turn around. The footsteps were familiar enough by now. Caleb appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in his work clothes from the previous day, which told her he hadn't slept either or hadn't changed after the late work he'd been doing in the barn. He looked at her at the table with the lamp lit. "Can't sleep," she said, which wasn't a question. "Never could. The night before something." He came in and poured himself water and leaned against the counter. He didn't sit down, which was, she'd noticed, what he did when he was working something out. He needed to stay vertical when his mind was moving. "Are you worried about tomorrow?" she said. "About you," he said. Simple, direct, the way he was always direct. "About whether you'll have what you need. Holt thinks the case is strong. Holt thinks legally. I'm thinking about you standing in that room." He looked at her. "You'll be standing up there alone. I know." "I'll be there," he said, "in the room. I'm testifying, and then I'll be in the room." She looked at him. There was something that wanted to resolve itself in her chest, something that had been building and that she was holding in place with both hands, because the timing was wrong and the situation was wrong and she didn't entirely trust herself. But she looked at him standing against the counter at 4 a.m. in yesterday's clothes because he hadn't slept either, and she thought about what it meant that he was here, that he had been consistently here. Not because it was easy or convenient, but because it was simply where he'd decided to be. "Caleb," she said. "Don't," he said quietly. She stopped. "Not tonight," he said. "Get through tomorrow first." She understood. He meant it kindly, not as rejection, but as protection, giving her the space to handle one thing before adding another. She understood it completely, and she was grateful for it. And she was also, she admitted to herself alone in the small hours of that kitchen, more grateful that there would be a tomorrow to have that conversation in. "All right," she said. He stayed until the sky started to gray in the east, both of them quiet at the table with the lamp burning low between them. The kind of silence that had nothing uneasy in it, only the weight of a day approaching. Then she got up and started making coffee, because there was a hearing in 5 hours, and she intended to be ready. The Red Hollow Courthouse was the largest building on the main street, a frame structure with a peaked roof and a covered porch that ran across the front. By the time Evelyn arrived with Caleb and Holt at 8:30 in the morning, there were already people gathered on the porch and in the street outside, more than she'd expected. Enough that she understood this had become a community event in the way small-town proceedings did when they touched something real. She saw Whitmore standing near the far end of the porch, with a man she didn't know, someone he'd brought in from outside, a lawyer in a better suit than anything Red Hollow produced. He looked at her when she came up the steps, and his expression was controlled and confident, a man who had done the math and liked his numbers. She looked back at him. She did not look away first. Inside, the courtroom was a single large room with benches along both sides and a raised desk at the front where Judge Alderman was already seated, reviewing papers. He was older than she'd imagined, white-haired and compact, with the slightly impatient air of a man who had heard too many cases to have patience for ones that wasted his time. Agnes was already there, sitting in the second row with her hands folded in her lap, and she caught Evelyn's eye and gave a small nod that said everything it needed to say. Holt led her to the respondent's table and pulled out the chair and spread his papers. Across the room, Whitmore's lawyer was doing the same at the plaintiff's table with the precise movements of a man who was comfortable in courtrooms. Will wasn't there. Pete's wife had him for the day, which Evelyn was glad of. There was enough in this room without adding a 5-year-old's witnessing to it. She sat down. She put her hand in her pocket and felt the folded list. Judge Alderman looked up from his papers and surveyed the room with the expression of a man counting the crowd and noting that it was larger than he'd expected. "Let's get started," he said, and Evelyn straightened her back and folded her hands on the table in front of her and waited. Judge Henry Alderman had been writing circuit courts in the territory for 11 years, and in that time he had heard cases involving land fraud, cattle theft, disputed wills, assault, and at least 4 different interpretations of the same water rights agreement. He had a particular tolerance for complexity and a particular intolerance for theater, and within the first 10 minutes of the Whitmore proceeding, he had already identified which kind of case this was going to be. He let Whitmore's lawyer, a man named Carver, brought in from the county seat, polished in the way of men who charged accordingly, deliver the opening statement without interruption. Carver was good at his work in the technical sense. He constructed the argument cleanly. A written correspondence constituting a formal agreement, a woman who had accepted terms and then, he implied, reconsidered upon arrival and sought more advantageous arrangements, leaving his client with reputational damage and the costs of a match that had come to nothing. He did not say exactly that Evelyn had calculated her way into a better situation at Whitmore's expense. He didn't have to. The implication was built into the phrasing, assembled from suggestions rather than stated claims, and Evelyn sat at her table and listened to it and kept her hands flat and still in front of her and did not let anything show. Holt's opening was shorter. He said that the evidence would demonstrate a straightforward sequence of facts, that Douglas Whitmore had departed Red Hollow 6 days prior to the agreed arrival date, that he had communicated this to no one, and that the woman he'd invited to travel 800 miles had arrived to find him gone. He said the word abandoned once, clearly, and then sat down. Judge Alderman looked at both tables. "Plaintiff's first witness," he said. Carver called Whitmore. Whitmore took the stand with the ease of a man who was comfortable being looked at. He was well-dressed, composed, and he told his version of events in a voice calibrated to sound reasonable. The voice of a man who was genuinely sorry. Things had gotten complicated, who wished it could have been handled differently, who was only here because he'd been left with no choice. He said that circumstances had changed rapidly, and that he'd done his best to communicate the change. He said the arrangement had been a mutual one, that both parties had entered freely, and that both parties had equal responsibility for its failure. Carver led him through it carefully. Whitmore was good at the witness stand. Not theatrical, not aggressive, just plausible. The version of events he described was not impossible. It was just false. When it was Holt's turn to question him, he stood up and buttoned his jacket and approached the witness stand with the slightly distracted air that people who didn't know him sometimes mistook for uncertainty. "Mr. Whitmore, on what date did you depart Red Hollow?" "I believe it was the 14th of April. "You believe. Do you have any documentation of that date?" "I don't have it with me, no." Holt nodded slowly. "I have here a record from the Red Hollow station master, Mr. Briggs, documenting your departure on the 11th of April. He held up the document. "Does that accord with your recollection?" A pause. Brief, but there. It may have been the 11th, yes. Miss Hartwell's agreed arrival date was the 17th of April. Is that correct? Approximately, yes. So you departed 6 days before she was scheduled to arrive. I had already communicated. I'll ask you to answer the question I asked, Holt said, still pleasantly. You departed 6 days before her scheduled arrival. Yes or no? Yes. And when you say you communicated this change, to whom did you communicate it, and when? Whitmore's jaw moved slightly. I spoke to Agnes Daly at the hotel. I asked her to. When? The evening before I left. So you informed the hotel proprietor the evening before your departure, and expected her to convey this information to a woman traveling from Ohio with no direct communication from yourself? Holt let that sit in the room for a moment. Did you write to Miss Hartwell directly? I intended to write. Did you write to her? No. Did you send a telegram to her address in Ohio? No. Did you make any direct attempt to inform Miss Hartwell that you were leaving before her arrival? The pause this time was longer. The room was very quiet. No, Whitmore said. Holt returned to his table. He picked up a sheet of paper. I'd like to ask you about your correspondence practices, Mr. Whitmore. During the period in which you were writing to Miss Hartwell, approximately September of last year through April of this year, were you also corresponding with any other women regarding the possibility of marriage? Carver was on his feet. Objection! Relevance. Judge Alderman looked at Holt. The character of the plaintiff's correspondence practices bears directly on whether the agreement he claims existed was entered into in good faith, Holt said. It also speaks to whether the damages he alleges are genuine. The judge looked at Carver. Overruled. Witness will answer. Whitmore had shifted almost imperceptibly in his chair. Just a fraction, just enough for Evelyn to see it from where she sat. I may have had other correspondences, he said. You may have, Holt said. Let me be more specific. Were you, during the same period you were corresponding with Miss Hartwell, also corresponding with a woman named Ruth Alderman of Salina, Kansas, regarding the prospect of marriage? A silence that was different in quality from the ones before it. I knew a Mrs. Alderman, yes. Were you corresponding with her about the prospect of marriage? We had exchanged letters, yes. Simultaneously with your correspondence with Miss Hartwell. It was not a question. Whitmore understood that. There was some overlap, yes. And were you also, during this same period, corresponding with a woman named Dorothy Vance of Springfield, Missouri, regarding the possibility of marriage? The room shifted. Not loudly. There was no outburst, no dramatic gasp, only the particular collective adjustment of a crowd that had just received information that changed how they were understanding what they were watching. Whitmore looked at Carver. Carver's face was carefully still, which told Evelyn he hadn't known about Dorothy Vance either. I may have exchanged some letters. Yes or no, Mr. Whitmore? Were you corresponding with Dorothy Vance about the prospect of marriage at the same time you were corresponding with Miss Hartwell? Yes, he said. The word came out flat and stripped of its earlier ease. Holt set the paper down. So in the months leading up to Miss Hartwell's arrival, you were simultaneously corresponding with at least 3 women about the prospect of marriage. You sold your property, and you departed the territory without directly informing any of them. He paused. I have no further questions for this witness. He sat down. The room had changed temperature. Evelyn could feel it. Not the room's actual temperature, which was warm and close with the number of bodies in it, but the social temperature, the way a space felt when the weight of a crowd's attention shifted direction. Whitmore stepped down from the stand. He walked back to his table with the measured pace of a man who knew he was being watched and was working hard not to show what was happening underneath it. Agnes testified next for the defense. She was brief, clear, and precise in the way of a woman who ran a business and understood that clarity was a form of respect for other people's time. She confirmed the date of Whitmore's departure, confirmed that he had spoken to her the evening before, and asked her to hold any correspondence for Miss Hartwell, confirmed that she had sent a telegram to the Ohio address upon Whitmore's request and her own initiative, and confirmed that it had arrived after Miss Hartwell had already departed for the territory. Carver cross-examined her gently, probing for uncertainty in the dates, for any softness in the timeline that might suggest ambiguity. There was none. Agnes had kept records. She said so when he pressed. I run a hotel, Mr. Carver, she said. I keep records of who comes and goes and when. It's not complicated. Martin Greeley testified to the debt settlement visit. Whitmore coming to his store the day before departure to settle a credit account, which established both the departure date and the premeditation of it, since a man who was leaving due to sudden urgent circumstances did not typically take the time to settle small accounts with feed merchants. The station master's records were entered into evidence. They were not dramatic. They were simply accurate, and accuracy, in this particular proceeding, was the most damaging thing possible for Douglas Whitmore. Caleb was called forth. He walked to the stand in his work clothes, which he'd worn deliberately. Evelyn suspected this without being able to prove it, but she'd spent enough time reading him to understand the kind of choices he made without making a show of them. He took the oath. He settled into the chair with the economy of movement of a man who was used to doing things without wasting effort. Holt asked him to describe Miss Hartwell's arrival at his ranch. She came to look at the position the afternoon of her second day in Red Hollow, Caleb said. She'd arrived by train the day before and found no one waiting for her. She had limited funds and no arrangements. He said this flatly, as facts. I offered her work because I needed a housekeeper and she needed a position. We agreed on terms. What were your observations of Miss Hartwell's conduct during the time she's been employed at your ranch? She works hard, she is honest, she does what she says she'll do. He paused. She fixed things that needed fixing. She didn't complain about what she found. And when Mr. Whitmore came to your property? He came unannounced. He told Miss Hartwell there were legal matters between them. She spoke with him directly. He implied that she should reconsider her position. Caleb looked at the judge rather than at Whitmore. She told him she'd think about it. After he left, she went to speak with Mr. Holt. Did Mr. Whitmore's visit appear to intimidate Miss Hartwell? Caleb thought about it. She was shaken, he said. She's honest enough to admit that. A brief pause. But she didn't run. She went and got more information instead. Carver's cross-examination was brief and had the quality of something obligatory rather than hopeful. He asked whether Caleb had any personal interest in the outcome of the case. Caleb said he had an interest in it being resolved fairly, which was not the answer Carver wanted, but was, as everyone in the room understood, the true one. When Caleb returned to his seat in the gallery, he sat 2 rows behind Evelyn, and she did not turn around. But she felt the presence of him settling in behind her, and she straightened her back slightly, and she kept her hand still on the table, and she waited for her name. Respondent's witness, Holt said. Miss Evelyn Hartwell. She rose from the table and walked to the witness stand, and she was aware with every step of the weight of the room's attention. Not hostile, not clearly friendly, just present and watching, the specific attention of a crowd that had not yet decided what it was going to believe. She sat down. She looked at Judge Alderman, who was looking at her with the level, evaluating gaze of a man who was in the habit of reading people quickly. Holt stood. Miss Hartwell, can you tell the court, in your own words, what brought you to Red Hollow? I answered an advertisement, she said. Her voice was steady. She'd known it would be. A widower seeking a wife. We corresponded for 5 months. I read his letters carefully. I believed they were sincere. I gave notice at my teaching position, gave up my rented room, and traveled 800 miles on the basis of that belief. And what did you find when you arrived? An empty platform, she said. No one waiting. The hotel proprietor telling me he'd left 6 days prior. What was your situation at that point? I had $43 and a traveling bag. She did not say this with self-pity. She said it as arithmetic. No position, no family I could return to, no reserved room. The train I'd arrived on had left. What did you do? I took a room at the hotel. The following day I began trying to understand my options. Mr. Mercer offered me work. I accepted because it was honest work at a fair wage, and because I needed it. Holt nodded. When Mr. Whitmore returned and contacted you regarding legal matters, what was your response? I went to speak with Mr. Holt. I wanted to understand whether there was a legitimate legal claim against me before deciding how to respond to it. She paused. There wasn't. I had honored every part of any arrangement between us. I arrived when I was supposed to arrive. He did not. Did Mr. Whitmore's letter or his subsequent visit cause you to consider leaving Red Hollow? She looked at Whitmore. He was watching her with the careful expression of a man managing what his face was showing. No, she said. Why not? She thought about how to answer that, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wanted to say it right. Not dramatically, not for effect, just accurately. Because leaving would have meant accepting a version of events that wasn't true, she said, and I wasn't willing to do that. Holt sat down. Carver stood. He was good at this. She'd had 3 weeks to watch him work, and she understood his method, which was to approach from an angle, to apply pressure at the edges of a story rather than attacking the center of it, to find the small uncertainties and amplify them until they cast doubt on the larger account. Miss Hartwell, you traveled 800 miles to marry a man you'd never met. I traveled 800 miles to meet a man I'd corresponded with extensively, yes. A man you'd never seen. Correct. Didn't that seem imprudent to you? She looked at him. I had read 16 of his letters. I had formed a considered opinion of his character based on those letters. The imprudence, as it turned out, was in trusting that he was who his letters suggested he was. That's not the same as acting rashly. But you had no guarantee. No one has guarantees, Mr. Carver. People make decisions based on available information and the judgment they've developed over the course of their lives. I made mine. His subsequent behavior demonstrated that my information was false. That is not a failure of my judgment. That is a failure of his honesty. A murmur in the gallery. Judge Alderman did not call for order, which told Evelyn something. Carver changed direction. You're currently employed at Mr. Mercer's ranch. Yes, a comfortable position. A working position. I cook, I clean, I manage the household. And you came to that position directly as a result of this situation. I came to that position because I had no other options after being abandoned in a town where I knew no one. She kept her voice level. If you're suggesting that I manufactured this situation in order to obtain employment at a ranch, I'll ask you to explain how a woman in Ohio anticipated and arranged for the specific sequence of events that brought her here. Another murmur, this one larger. Carver looked at his papers. He tried 2 more approaches, each one reasonable in isolation, each one insufficient when she answered it directly and factually, and then he said he had no further questions, which was the first honest thing he'd said all morning, because there was nothing more useful he could do. She stepped down from the stand. She walked back to her table and sat down and put her hand in her pocket and felt the folded list, and she let out a slow breath that no one could hear. Holt made his closing argument in 11 minutes. He was not a theatrical man, and the argument did not require theater. It required only the arrangement of established facts in their correct order, which he did with the precision of someone who had been waiting to do exactly this. A man had invited a woman to travel 800 miles. He had made no direct attempt to inform her he was leaving. He had left 6 days before her arrival. He had simultaneously been conducting identical correspondence with 2 other women, a fact that spoke not to changed circumstances, but to a pattern of conduct that the court should weigh carefully when assessing the plaintiff's claims of harm to his character. The plaintiff asked this court to award him damages for breach of agreement, Holt said. The evidence shows he was not the victim of a breach. He was the architect of one. The question before this court is not whether Miss Hartwell caused harm to Mr. Whitmore. The question is whether this court will allow a man who behaved as he behaved to use the machinery of the law as an additional instrument of harm against a woman he already wronged once. He paused. I trust that it will not. Carver's closing was longer and technically more elaborate and less honest. He spoke about the uncertainty of frontier arrangements, about the difficulty of communication across long distances, about the good faith his client had attempted to demonstrate. He was professional about it. He made the best case he could with what he had. When he finished, Judge Alderman looked at his papers for a long moment. The courtroom was very quiet. I've heard enough to rule, the judge said. He looked at Whitmore's table, then at Evelyn's. The plaintiff's claim depends on establishing that a binding agreement existed and that the respondent was responsible for its failure, he said. The evidence does not support this. The timeline of the plaintiff's departure, documented by the station master's records and corroborated by multiple witnesses, establishes that he left 6 days before the respondent's scheduled arrival without direct notification. The respondent honored the terms of the arrangement to the extent of traveling 800 miles. The plaintiff did not. He picked up the papers and set them down again, a habit of emphasis. Furthermore, the evidence of simultaneous correspondence with multiple women is deeply relevant to the plaintiff's claim of reputational harm. A man who conducts himself in this manner toward multiple women in multiple states does not suffer reputational harm from the exposure of that conduct. He suffers the natural consequence of it. The judge's voice was dry, but not unkind. The claim is dismissed. Court costs to the plaintiff. He struck the desk once with the flat of his hand. He didn't use a gavel, Evelyn noticed, just his palm. And that was it. The room broke open, not loudly, not like a scene in a story where everyone applauds and the villain storms out. What happened was more ordinary and more real than that. People began talking to each other in low voices. Agnes turned around in her bench and caught Evelyn's eye and nodded, a small nod with a great deal in it. Holt was gathering his papers with the calm, steady movements of a man who had expected this outcome and was nonetheless relieved by it. Martin Greeley, somewhere in the gallery behind her, said something she couldn't make out. Whitmore and Carver were talking in low voices at their table. Whitmore's face was controlled, but the ease was gone from it. The comfortable assumption of a man whose outcomes generally satisfied him. He was still standing, still dressed well, still composed in the external way, but something underneath all of that had shifted, and the room knew it. And he knew the room knew it. He looked at Evelyn once. She looked back. She didn't say anything, and neither did he. And then he turned and walked out of the courtroom with Carver beside him, and the door swung shut behind them. And that was the last she saw of Douglas Whitmore. Outside, on the porch of the courthouse, the afternoon light was bright and direct, and the street below was going about its ordinary business in the way that streets did, indifferent to what had happened inside. Evelyn stood at the top of the steps and let the light fall on her face and breathed. She heard the door behind her and knew by the footstep that it was Caleb. He stood beside her on the porch, looking out at the street the way they looked at things sometimes, both of them toward the same horizon, not at each other. "All right," he said. She thought about that, about whether she was. "I'm tired," she said, which was honest, "and hungry. I haven't eaten since 4 in the morning. Agnes said there's food at the hotel." "Then let's go to the hotel." They went down the steps together. Agnes joined them at the bottom, and then Holt, and then, unexpectedly, Martin Greeley, who fell into step with them with the naturalness of a man who had decided he was part of this group, whether anyone had formally invited him or not. They walked down the main street of Red Hollow in the late afternoon light, and people watched from doorways and porches, and Evelyn walked with her head up and her pace steady, and the town arranged itself around this fact. Lunch at the hotel was loud and somewhat chaotic in the comfortable way of a gathering that hadn't been planned. Agnes fed everyone and didn't accept payment and deflected thanks with the brisk efficiency of someone who gave things because they wanted to, not because they wanted the acknowledgement of giving them. Holt ate with his jacket off, which seemed to be his version of celebration. Greeley told a story about the first time he'd encountered Whitmore that was mildly uncharitable and entirely accurate. Caleb ate and listened and said little, which was how he was in groups of people, present but contained, watching more than participating. She noticed him watching her at one point from across the table, and she met his eyes and he didn't look away, and something passed between them that was not finally complicated. After, they collected Will from Pete's wife and drove back to the ranch in the long evening light. Will between them on the seat, talking about what he'd done that afternoon with a thoroughness that required very little response and occupied the whole drive. When they pulled into the yard, Will climbed down from the wagon and ran toward the barn to see the horses, which he did every time he came home, regardless of what else was happening, and the yard was quiet around them. Caleb set the brake and got down and came around to her side, which he sometimes did when she was slow-moving or her hands were full, and she stepped down and they were standing close together in the yard with the evening light on the hills and Will's voice carrying from the barn. "Caleb," she said. "Evelyn." "You said not tonight," she said. "In the kitchen, at 4 in the morning. You said get through tomorrow first." He looked at her. "It's not tonight anymore." "No," she said. "It's not." He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that had weight to it, that was not absence, but presence. "I don't know how to say this without it sounding like something it might be too soon for," he said. "So I'm just going to say it plainly, which is how I say most things. You came here and you stayed. You worked hard, and you were honest, and you didn't ask anyone to feel sorry for you. And somewhere in the middle of all that, He stopped. He was working through the phrasing. She could see him doing it, which she found she didn't mind because it was real rather than rehearsed. I stopped thinking of you as someone who was here temporarily. She looked at him for a long moment. When did that happen? She said. He thought about it. Probably the night you sat at the kitchen table and told me you were scared, but you weren't going to run, he said. Somewhere around then. She thought about the room at the end of the hall, and the window that faced east, and the word she'd said without thinking on the road back from the schoolhouse. Home. She thought about 5 weeks in one place building something she hadn't planned to build, and finding that it was more solid than she'd known to expect. I'm not leaving, she said. It was not a promise exactly. It was a statement of fact, the way she made most statements. I want you to know that, not because of today, and not because I don't have anywhere else to go, because I don't want to go anywhere else. He looked at her with the steady attention she'd come to trust. All right, he said. That was all. It was enough. More than enough for now, which was how it should be. There was time. There was the long summer ahead, and the ranch work, and Will's particular brand of daily chaos, and the gradual, patient building of things that were worth building. She turned toward the house, and after a moment he fell into step beside her, and from the barn Will called something about the bay horse's leg. Something he'd noticed. Something that needed looking at. And Caleb changed direction without breaking stride, and she went in through the kitchen door alone. She stood in the kitchen for a moment. The house was familiar now in the way it hadn't been 6 weeks ago. The particular quality of its late afternoon light, the way the floorboards spoke under her feet, the smell of the wood and the leather and the dust of a working place. She rolled up her sleeves and started supper. Supper that evening was a quiet thing, not the strained quiet of the weeks before the hearing, when the house had carried the particular tension of something unresolved and large moving toward them, but a different kind, the kind that came after, the kind that had room in it. Will ate his food and talked about the bay horse's leg, which Caleb had examined and pronounced sound but worth watching, and about something one of Pete's children had said that afternoon that Will had found either funny or objectionable, the account shifting between the two interpretations as he told it. Caleb listened and responded in the measured way he had with his son, not falsely animated, not distracted, just there, asking the specific follow-up questions that told a child they had actually been heard rather than tolerated. Evelyn sat at her end of the table and ate and listened and thought about the last 6 weeks, and about the hearing and about the courtroom and about Douglas Whitmore's face when the judge's ruling came down. She thought about what it had cost her to get to this evening, not in money, though there had been costs there too, but in the other currencies that didn't get named as often. The willingness to hold still when everything in her wanted to give up and go somewhere nobody knew her name. The willingness to keep working when she was afraid, to keep being honest about being afraid rather than performing a courage she didn't entirely feel. She thought about what Holt had said once, in a moment of candor that was more personal than he usually allowed himself. That the hardest thing about frontier courts wasn't the law, which was manageable, but the fact that a woman standing alone in one was already at a structural disadvantage before she said a single word, and that the only way through that disadvantage was to be so specific, so factual, so unassailably accurate that the disadvantage had nothing to grip. She had done that. She was still here, and the supper was warm, and Will was describing with great specificity the way one of Pete's children had mispronounced a particular word. And outside the kitchen window, the sky had gone the particular deep blue of a clear frontier evening, and the lamp on the table was doing what lamps did in small, warm rooms, and none of it was perfect and all of it was real. Evelyn, Will said. She looked at him. Yes? Were you scared today? At the courthouse? The question was direct in the way his questions usually were, not intrusive, just genuinely curious, the way children ask things when they actually wanted to know, rather than when they were performing social interaction. Caleb had gone slightly still across the table. She thought he was probably wondering if she'd mind the question. She didn't. Yes, she said. I was. Will considered this. You didn't look scared. That's different from not being scared. He thought about that for a moment, seriously, turning it over. Pete's wife says being scared and acting scared are different things. Pete's wife is right. He nodded, absorbing it into some private framework he was building about how things worked. My mother was scared sometimes, he said. She told me that. He said it simply, without drama, the way he said things about his mother when he said them, which was not often, but when he did, it was always with this particular careful casualness, like he was carrying something fragile that he'd learned not to grip too tightly. The table was quiet for a moment. What did she say about it? Evelyn asked. She said being scared meant you were paying attention. He picked up his fork. She said the people who said they were never scared weren't brave, they just weren't paying attention. Caleb was looking at his plate. His face was doing something she understood by now. Not grief exactly, not anymore, but the particular expression of a man hearing an echo of a person he'd loved, coming back to him from an unexpected direction. Your mother was a smart woman, Evelyn said. I know, Will said. He finished his supper. He helped clear his plate without being asked, which was something Evelyn had started gently requiring 2 weeks in, and which he now did automatically. He said goodnight to both of them and went upstairs, and she could hear the specific pattern of his movements above her. The creak of the third stair, the drag of his boots being removed, the thump of one and then the other hitting the floor. She and Caleb sat at the table with the remains of supper around them and said nothing for a little while. It was not an awkward nothing. It was the kind of nothing that had been established between them over weeks of kitchen tables and late evenings and early mornings, the kind that required nothing to fill it. He talks about her more, Caleb said finally, since you've been here. She looked at him. I don't know if that's because of you specifically or just because the house has been different. He was looking at the table. But he talks about her more, and when he does, it used to hurt him to say it. You could hear it. Now it sounds more like he's just telling you something. She thought about what to say to that. She didn't want to say the wrong thing, and she also didn't want to say the right thing in the wrong way. Some correct sentiment delivered with too much gentleness that would turn it into a performance. Grief settles, she said. Not because the person gets less important, just because you find a way to carry it that doesn't cut you every time. He looked at her. You've had practice. My mother, 4 years ago. She folded her hands on the table. My father before that. I know the difference between the first year and the third year. Does it stop? No, she said honestly. It just gets incorporated. It becomes part of the structure rather than something you're constantly managing. He was quiet for a moment, turning this over in the way he turned things over. That's a useful way to think about it. It's not poetry, she said. No, that's why it's useful. She smiled. It was a real smile, which with her tended to be smaller than people expected. Not the broad social smile she could produce when required, but the actual thing, which was quieter and lasted longer. The days that followed settled into something that felt different from the cautious provisional arrangement of the first weeks. It was hard to name precisely when the shift had happened. It wasn't the courtroom or the porch in the evening after, though those had been part of it. It was something more gradual, more aggregate. The accumulation of ordinary days that had accrued enough weight to become something load-bearing. She wrote to Ruth Alderman the day after the hearing, not a formal letter, but a real one. 3 pages, honest about the shape of the weeks leading up to the court date, honest about being frightened and staying anyway, and full of genuine gratitude that was specific rather than generic, because she'd found that Ruth's statement had not just been useful legally, but had given Evelyn something harder to articulate. The knowledge that she had not been uniquely naive, that she had not been a fool alone, that what had been done to her had been done deliberately and with practice, and that its consequences were not a reflection of her judgment, but of his character. Ruth wrote back in 10 days. Her letter was funny in places, which Evelyn had not expected. She was a dry woman, Ruth Alderman, with the particular humor of someone who had processed something painful long enough to find its absurd edges. She wrote that she'd laughed at the word plaintiff as applied to Douglas Whitmore, since it was one of the more creative uses of language she'd encountered, and she wrote that she was glad Evelyn had stayed and glad she'd won and glad she'd written. They continued to correspond after that. Not frequently, once a month, sometimes less, but reliably. 2 women in different territories who had never met and had come to know each other through the unlikely fact of having been wronged by the same man. There was something in that Evelyn thought about occasionally, the way damage could become connection if you handled it right. The way a shared experience of being deceived could become the foundation of something genuine if the people involved were honest with each other. Dorothy Vance wrote once, briefly, to say she was glad of the outcome. Evelyn wrote back. That correspondence did not continue, which was fine. People gave what they had to give, and a single letter saying, "I'm glad," was its own kind of gift. July moved into August with the particular velocity of summer on the frontier. Long, hot days that were exhausting in a physical way that Evelyn had not been accustomed to in Ohio, where the heat was a different quality, more humid and more still. Here the heat was dry, and the wind moved through it in a way that was almost bearable, and the evenings cooled fast enough that the kitchen was genuinely pleasant by the time supper was done. She had been at the Mercer Ranch for almost 4 months. The month-to-month arrangement they'd started with had never been formally renewed or replaced. At some point in June, it had simply ceased to be relevant, not because it had been explicitly set aside, but because the daily reality of the place had outgrown the original terms. She was not just a housekeeper. She had taken over management of the household accounts, which Caleb had been keeping in a battered ledger with what could charitably be described as approximate attention, and which she reorganized in an afternoon and then maintained with the same methodical attention she gave everything else. She had replanted the kitchen garden properly, with a layout that would produce better through the fall. She had, over the course of 2 weeks in July, worked with Pete and the other hands on the second barn's roof, which had been leaking at the east end since winter and which Caleb had not had time to address. He'd come back from the east pasture one afternoon to find her on the barn roof with Pete and 2 of the other hands, moving with the careful competence of someone who had done physical work all her life. He'd stood in the yard for a moment, and she'd seen him from up there, a small figure below, hat in hand, looking up, and she'd called down, "The east edge was worse than it looked. We needed the extra hands." And he'd said, "All right," and gone into the house, and she'd understood that was approval. Will had started calling her Evelyn consistently, which she knew was significant in a way that was hard to put precisely into words. In the early weeks, he'd used the name carefully, with the formality of a child being polite to an adult he didn't know well. By July, he said it the way he said Pete's name or the names of the horses, casually, without ceremony, as part of the furniture of his days. She did not push for more than that. She was careful about it, about the space between being present in his life and trying to fill a shape that was already occupied by someone else. She was not his mother and would not pretend to be. But she was something, and that something had grown real enough that it no longer needed a name to be solid. One evening in late July, she was sitting with him on the porch steps, waiting for Caleb to come in from the field, and Will was looking at the hills the way he looked at things when he was about to ask something he'd been working up to. "Do you think you'll stay?" he said. She looked at him. "Where else would I go?" He shrugged. "I don't know, somewhere else. I'm not planning on it." He was quiet for a moment. He picked at a loose thread on his knee. "My father thinks you'll stay," he said. "I heard him tell Pete." She kept her face still, which required some effort. "Did he?" Pete asked him. Will looked at her sideways. "Pete makes bets. He bet Tom that you'd be gone by August." "And your father said?" "He said Pete was going to lose that bet." Will paused. He sounded pretty sure. She looked out at the hills. The evening light was doing what it did in this particular hour, turning everything amber and long-shadowed and beautiful in the specific way of things that were beautiful without effort. "Your father's usually right about things," she said. Will nodded, satisfied, and leaned against the porch post and went back to watching the hills. Caleb was not a man who said things before he was ready to say them. She had understood this from early on and had come to respect it because she was not entirely different in that way. She had grown up in a house where her father said what he meant without decoration, and her mother listened carefully and responded honestly, and she had absorbed both halves of that without quite knowing it. He said it on a Sunday morning in August, which was her day off, the one condition of her original employment that had been maintained. She'd fallen into the habit of spending Sunday mornings with coffee at the kitchen table and whatever book she was reading, and the house had the particular quality of Sunday mornings, quieter than weekdays. The work paused. The rhythm slowed. Caleb came in from the barn at 8:30, which was earlier than usual, and poured himself coffee and sat down across from her. He had the look of a man who had decided something and was now implementing it. She set her book down. He turned his cup in his hands. He looked at the table. Then he looked at her. "I want to ask you something," he said. And I want you to know before I ask it that the answer doesn't change anything about your position here. You're not at risk of losing your work or your room regardless of what you say. I need you to know that." She looked at him. "All right? I want to know if you'd be willing to consider—" He stopped. He'd prepared something, and he was finding that it wasn't coming out the way he'd prepared it, which she recognized because she'd had the same experience trying to arrange certain conversations in advance. "What I mean to say is that I think you already know what I'm going to ask, and I think you know what I'd like the answer to be. I'm not going to perform uncertainty about either of those things because you'd see through it anyway." "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "The answer is yes," she said. "That's what you were going to ask, and that's what I'm saying." He was quiet for a moment. Something settled in his face. Not a dramatic change, just the specific relaxation of someone who had been holding something tightly for a long time and had finally been able to set it down. "That was easier than I expected," he said. "You've been getting ready to ask that for 3 weeks," she said. "I've been waiting for you to be ready." He looked at her for a moment, and she thought she saw the beginning of the thing around his eyes that she'd come to recognize. That wasn't quite a smile, but was the feeling behind one. "You could have said something. You needed to say it first, I knew that." "How did you know that?" She picked up her coffee cup. "Because you're the kind of man who needs to be certain before he says a thing. If I'd said it first, you'd have spent 6 months wondering if you'd have arrived at it on your own." She looked at him. "This way, you know." He looked at her for a long moment. "You've been watching me," he said. "You've been watching me," she said. "We've been watching each other. That's how it works." There was nothing fast about what came after. That was by choice, hers and his both, which was one of the first things they agreed on when they talked about it properly, sitting at the same kitchen table on a Tuesday evening while Will slept upstairs and the lamp burned low between them. "I don't want to rush it for Will's sake," she said. "No," he agreed. "He needs time to understand what things are before they're official. He's had enough change. And I want to be honest about what I am here," she said. "Not performing a role for the household or the town. Actually being it." He looked at her. "That's exactly what I wanted to say." "I know," she said. "That's why I said it first this time." He almost laughed. She felt it more than heard it. A small shift in the room's atmosphere. The careful man briefly uncareful. "September," he said. "We'll talk to Will in September when school starts back and things are stable. Give him some time." "September," she agreed. They talked for another hour about practical things. The ranch, the accounts, the winter preparations, the south pasture fence that needed serious attention before November. The conversation moved between the personal and the practical the way their conversations had always moved, without the two registers feeling discontinuous, because they'd always been the same conversation underneath. This was, she thought, one of the things that was true about the life that had assembled itself around her in this territory. It was made of real things, not idealized things, not the things she'd imagined in her rented room in Ohio, reading letters from a man whose thoughtfulness was a performance. The things here were harder and less poetic and more durable. A roof that needed mending, a child who asked honest questions, a man who took 3 weeks to say something because he wanted to be sure he meant it. Real things. Solid things. Worth having because they were actual. She told Agnes in September, on a Wednesday morning visit that was by now a regular part of her life, one of the anchors she'd built in Red Hollow, the small rituals of belonging that accumulated into presence. Agnes received the news with the expression of someone who had seen it coming for months and was satisfied to have been right. "I knew when he drove you to see Holt," she said. "That was the 2nd week I was here." "I know," Agnes said. "He doesn't drive people places. He's driven me somewhere twice in the time I've known him, and both times there was a serious emergency. He drove you because he wanted to." Evelyn looked at her coffee cup. "You might be reading into it." "I am not reading into it," Agnes said, firmly and without apology. She told Will on a Saturday afternoon in mid-September. Not with Caleb. They talked about that. Had decided it was better for her to talk to him alone first, so that it wasn't the two of them presenting something as a done thing that Will had no part of. She found him in the yard after lunch, sitting on the fence watching Pete work with the young horse. She sat beside him on the fence, which she'd gotten better at. She'd grown up without livestock, and it had taken her embarrassingly long to be comfortable around the horses. and Will had been the one to show her how to approach the bay mare correctly, which she'd let him do because it was something he could teach, and he needed to know he could teach things. "Will," she said, "Your father and I have been talking about some things. About the future." She paused. "About staying." He was watching the young horse. Pete was working it on a long line, slow circles, patient and repetitive. "Like staying here?" Will said. "Yes? Permanently?" He was quiet for a moment. "Like officially?" "Yes." He pulled at a splinter on the fence post. She waited because she'd learned to wait with him, had learned that he processed things at his own pace, and that pressing him produced nothing useful. "Would anything change?" he said. She thought about that seriously, because it was a serious question. "Some things would. Your father and I would be," she paused, "married eventually, formally. You'd have a stepmother, which is a word that means something legally." "I know what it means." "Yes, I know you do." He pulled another splinter. The young horse completed a circle, and then another. "Would you still be Evelyn?" he said. She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "Like," he frowned, looking for the words. "Would you still be just Evelyn? Or would I have to call you something else?" She understood. "I'll always be Evelyn to you," she said. "Whatever you want to call me, that's your choice. There's no right answer." He thought about this for a long time, a genuinely long time, long enough that she started to wonder if she should say something more, but she held herself still and waited. "Okay," he said. "Okay? Yeah." He looked at her sideways with those dark eyes. "I just wanted to know if you were still going to be you." She looked at him for a moment and felt the particular fullness in the chest that came from something unexpectedly precise and true landing directly on target. "Yes," she said. "I'm always going to be me." He nodded. He looked back at Pete and the horse. "Okay then," he said. And that was settled, and she sat beside him on the fence for another 20 minutes while the young horse learned its circles. And that was how it was done. The wedding was in October, small and practical in the way that suited both of them. Agnes was there, and Holt, and Martin Greeley, and Pete and his wife, and the other ranch hands and their families, and a handful of Red Hollow townspeople who had by now formed their own opinion of Evelyn Hartwell, independent of any version Whitmore had tried to circulate, which had, in the week since the hearing, lost whatever purchase it had briefly had. Small towns had long memories for scandals, but they had longer memories for people who showed up every week and worked hard and were straight with their neighbors. And Evelyn had been doing that for 4 months now, and the town had begun to simply accept that she was part of what Red Hollow was. Will stood beside Caleb through the ceremony in his one formal jacket, which was slightly too short in the sleeves, and he was very solemn in the way of children who understood that they were part of something important. He didn't cry. She didn't either. Caleb looked at her through the words being said with the full, steady attention he gave things that mattered, and she looked back, and it was not romantic in the theatrical sense. It was something quieter and realer than that. Two people who had found each other through a series of circumstances that had been terrible in the beginning and true at the end, making a deliberate choice. The celebration after was louder than either of them had planned, because Agnes had taken charge of the food, and Pete had located whiskey from somewhere, and the combination of these two facts had produced something beyond what the occasion had formally required. There was laughter in the Mercer house that evening that the walls hadn't heard in a long time, and Evelyn stood in the middle of it and thought about the train platform in April, and the empty town, and the $43. She thought about what it was to have your plan collapse completely, and to discover that what came after the collapse was more solid than the plan had ever been. There are things you don't understand about yourself until you've been tested in a specific way, and one of them is this. You don't know the difference between what you wanted and what you were actually looking for until you've had the wrong version of it and survived it. Evelyn had wanted a husband and a home and a life that was more than the same room above the same harness shop with the same view of the same alley. Those were real wants, and they had led her to make a reasonable decision given the information she had. What she'd found instead was more complicated and less neat and considerably more worth having. A man who didn't say things until he was sure he meant them. A boy who wanted to know if she was still going to be herself. A town that had taken her in by degrees. through witnessing her work and her honesty and her willingness to stand up when standing up was expensive. A household that was hers because she'd earned it, not because someone had conferred it. There's a thing people say about this kind of story, that the woman found love when she stopped looking for it, or that everything happens for a reason, or any number of other constructions that take the hard, specific work of surviving something and smooth it into a shape that feels tidy from the outside. She didn't believe any of those constructions. She believed in the arithmetic of it, that she had arrived with almost nothing, that she had worked with what she had, that she had refused to be diminished by a man who wanted her diminished, and that she had, through those specific efforts on those specific days, built the life she was living. Not luck, not fate, work and honesty, and the willingness to stay when staying was hard. That's not a simple thing to do. It sounds simple when you say it. It is not simple when you are doing it, alone in a strange town with $43 and the sound of a train pulling away behind you. It is not simple when you are sitting at a kitchen table at 4 in, the night before a court hearing, writing a list of facts to hold on to because the fear is real and the outcome is not guaranteed. What she had learned, what she would carry from this into every year that followed, was not that things worked out. They didn't always. They had worked out in her case through a combination of her own decisions and the decency of specific people who could have chosen differently and didn't. What she had learned was that surviving the collapse of what you planned and continuing to act with honesty and intention was itself a form of building, that you didn't need the plan to be intact. You needed to keep your hands working and your eyes open and your understanding of yourself stable enough to know what you would and wouldn't accept. She had not accepted being made small. That, at the end of all of it, was the thing. Not the victory in the courtroom, which had been satisfying, and not the life at the ranch, which was good, but the original decision made on the second morning in a strange hotel room in a strange town, to stay, to work, to refuse the version of herself that the situation was trying to impose on her. Everything else had grown from that. Neat. November came in fast and cold, the way it did in the territory, the warmth of fall giving way in a matter of days to something that had iron in it. The Mercer Ranch prepared for winter the way ranches did, with the accumulated labor of the season's end, the stores laid in and the stock moved and the fences checked and rechecked and the barn banked against the coming cold. Evelyn worked through it alongside everyone else, which was not a surprise to anyone by that point. Pete's wife had said to Agnes, who had told Evelyn, with the particular enjoyment of a woman who had been right, that Evelyn Mercer was the best thing to happen to that ranch, since the creek changed course and started running better to the south pasture, which was a frontier compliment of the highest order. One afternoon in late November, she was in the kitchen putting up the last of the fall preserves when Will came in from school. Caleb collected him now in the wagon every Friday, and she could hear the specific sound of it in the yard, the horses and the brake, and the particular pattern of Will's boots on the porch steps. He came in with his bag and his jacket half undone and his hair doing what it always did when he'd been outside in wind, which was everything. "Good week?" she said. He dropped his bag on the chair and came to look at what she was doing. He'd developed a practical interest in the kitchen over the fall. Not cooking exactly, but the chemistry of it, the processes, the specific questions of why things changed when you applied heat or salt or time. She'd answered his questions when he asked them, which he did frequently. "We did geography today," he said. "Mr. Carsey showed us Ohio on the map." She looked at him. "It's far," he said. "It is." "Is that where you were born?" "Yes. Lived there my whole life until April." He looked at the jars lined up on the counter. "Do you miss it?" She thought about that honestly, because he deserved the honest answer rather than the easy one. "I miss things about it," she said. "My mother's house, some of the students I taught, the way the maple trees looked in autumn." She paused. "I don't miss the life I was living there. Does that make sense?" He thought about it. "Like how you can miss the old barn door even though the new one is better?" She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "Exactly like that." He nodded. He pulled out his chair and sat down and started unpacking his school bag with the orderly thoroughness of a child who had been taught by someone who kept things organized. "Caleb says you probably have more maple trees in Ohio than we have fence posts," he said. "Your father may be right about that." "He usually is," Will said, with the easy certainty of a child who had decided this was a fact about the world, reliable as weather. She went back to her preserves. Outside, she could hear Caleb unhitching the horses, the familiar sounds of the yard at end of day, the shuffle and blow of the animals, Pete's voice, the clank of the harness. The kitchen was warm, and the preserves were nearly done, and the table behind her had a child at it doing his lessons, and the man who had come in from the cold in 20 minutes for supper was her husband. None of this was what she'd planned. She let herself feel that fully, standing at the kitchen counter with the late afternoon light on the windowsill and the smell of wood smoke beginning to come in from outside. She let herself feel the full strangeness of it, that the path from the Ohio harness shop to this kitchen in the Red Hollow territory had run through abandonment and fear and a courtroom and a 4 a.m. conversation and a small boy falling asleep against her arm on a wagon road. That all of that had been necessary, that she couldn't have arrived here by any cleaner route because the clean route would have delivered her to the wrong place, to a life with a man who had never meant a word he'd written, to a house she'd been chosen for rather than a house she'd built her way into. She was where she was because she had gone through the hard way and stayed honest the whole time and refused to be anyone other than herself. That was not a lesson that arrived easily. It was not a thing you could be told in advance and have it mean anything. You had to live the April morning on the platform, the $43, the letter in the apron pocket, the 4 a.m. fear. And then you had to live through what came after. And then you had to look back and understand that the thing you almost ran from was the thing that made you. The kitchen door opened and Caleb came in with the cold air and the smell of horses and the last of the day's light behind him. He pulled off his hat and looked around the kitchen the way he looked around it now, not like a man arriving somewhere that belonged to him, but like a man arriving somewhere that belonged to them both, which was a different thing entirely. "Supper soon?" he said. 20 minutes, she said. He sat down across from Will, and Will told him about the map of Ohio, and Caleb asked the follow-up questions that showed he'd actually listened, and the kitchen held them all in the way of rooms that had been brought back to life by people who had needed each other. Outside, the wind was coming in from the north, the first real winter wind of the season, and it moved across the ranch and the hills and the creek and the dry grass with the force of something that had been traveling a long way to arrive here. The house held against it, which was what houses were for. Inside, the lamp was lit. That was enough. That was, in the end, exactly enough.